listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America with this broken and fractured globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And that would strongly imply that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Shane is having a bit of a trouble with his Wi-Fi signal, so he's joining us by phone. So things may be a little
storm. It was a storm. A storm apparently that didn't even really seem that crazy, but we got fiber optic, and it just messed up some of the wiring off of our property. Apparently, anyway.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. That's massively unfortunate. So, but let's get into the headlines. In the news, the IMF raised its forecast for the global economy for this year and the next. That is a positive thing, I suppose. You have pro-democracy protesters in Myanmar sprayed red paint on the road signs and bus stops to symbolize blood spilled by the coup regime. Water restrictions in Taiwan over the massive drought has more than 1 million people will lose their water supply. You also have a case where Joe Biden and Iranians are basically negotiating the JCPOA. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the monologue, but basically they're in indirect talks, quote unquote, in Vienna. Now, whatever you may hear from mainstream media and the way that they talk about this, they may talk about this with a certain brashness or with a certain bravado, and it may act as if Iran is the one that is out of sync and out of kilter, because that's the way we function, that's the way we think. But the reality of it is that Donald Trump did everything that he could, short of a war, to get Iran to basically rejoin, or let's say renegotiate a deal that had already been negotiated. They told him no. Donald Trump killed several Iranians in this process, including Qasem Soleimani, certain Iranian scientists. And this, again, is pursuant to the pressure strategy that Donald Trump was using when he went about this. And on top of all of this, on top of all the pressure strategy, he failed. So what is Joe Biden going to do? If Donald Trump went through all of that and still failed, what is Joe Biden going to do short of a war? And do you believe that Joe Biden wants a war? Well, the answer is, of course, Joe Biden doesn't want a war, which means that Joe Biden needs to rejoin the JCPOA with one catch and one caveat. He needs to do so without appearing, in his eyes, weak. He doesn't want the Republican Party to say he's weak. One of our guests made the point that it could also be Israel basically whispering in his ear, being against the policy. But I strongly suggest, just based on the way that Psaki and some of the other people are talking, that it has to do with weakness. If you hear Psaki, she would say, well, the United States is working to get Iran back into compliance. What do you mean Iran back into compliance? Iran stayed with the deal for an entire year. You were the one that backed out of it. It's the way they talk about it. Indirect talks. Why is this indirect talks? Because it doesn't want to seem like the United States is too lusty with getting the JCPOA. All of this is this kind of political maneuvering entirely to save face. It's a dance, it's theater, and yet it's there to save face. Iran has nothing to give in regards to, let's say, concessions in this case. Any concession that it gives would be complicity to what the U.S. has been doing for the last year or 3 years under Donald Trump. That is something that they won't do, nor could they do politically. Just making the point. So those negotiations are taking place right now. It is going to be very interesting to see how those negotiations come out. And just hearing Jen Psaki talk about it, Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how those negotiations turn out. Shane, have you been following this story at all? The talks, the Iranian talks, with basically the dance that these guys are doing. Because initially there wasn't going to be any communication, any talks. Then all of a sudden we heard that okay, there were going to be talks. And in the beginning, when Joe Biden was talking about this, he was very hawkish and boisterous, acting as if he was going to go further than Trump on this and everything else. And then reality set in. The talk became far more moderate or far more moderated. And it became we need to join the deal together. It became a together thing as opposed to the Iranians are going to do X or Y. They realized they had nowhere else to go. And so now they're in a position where they need Iran to take that deal. And Iran has shown that they can go without it. And not to mention the deal with China on some level mitigates this thing with the U.S. But between the two parties, it's the U.S. that needs the deal. What do you think about this? I mean, I'm pretty sure you've been following because we've been talking about it on the show.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's significant. I think that it's a bad look for the Biden administration to have to change its tune so quickly into his first term. Just a couple of months in, you're seeing a major shift in policy that I guess I'll put it like this: as we've said on previous interviews in the past on the show, it seems like he doesn't quite know what he's doing here in a weird way, where there's like a disorientation when it comes to the policies, the priorities of the administration in a way that with Trump, you could kind of make sense of over time in a gestalt sense because he was a businessman and therefore in his dealings with people and in negotiation, he would move back and forth and sometimes speak cruelly and sometimes more kindly of people that he was dealing with and all sorts of bombastic tweets with the idea that you can get them to the negotiating table and extract some concessions from them, but then make a deal, do the compromise thing. And again, I don't know exactly. That doesn't seem to be Biden's modus operandi, and it doesn't seem like he's pursuing that kind of thing. So what are they doing here? Why signal so aggressively as you come in, and then without preface or any kind of explanation, change your tune fairly quickly and act a little bit more like a puppy dog? I don't know.
He didn't have a choice.
Still deadly serious.
Well, I'm saying he didn't have a choice. Because if you think about it, what did Iran do? Iran started the moment that they realized that the U.S. had shot his bullets. All of the bullets were out. Trump did the maximum pressure strategy. He didn't want a war. Here's the thing. The politics between the United States and Iran under the Trump administration were fascinating in the sense that neither party wanted a war. Both parties were using brinksmanship in order to create this kind of tit-for-tat balance between the two. So you would have Trump, killed Soleimani. Now, at that point, it's up in the air. If Iran decides to attack, they decide to attack, and it would be justifiable considering that we just murdered the guy. They hit back. Now the U.S. has the decision on whether or not it wants to attack. And what does Trump do? He pulls back. Because what he knows is that at a certain point, he can no longer control what happens. He knows it. He doesn't want a war. Iran knows Trump doesn't want a war. Well, the same rules apply for Joe Biden, and Joe Biden is not even going to go as far as Trump went. So the moment that Iran starts cranking up the enrichment, we're going to crank it up to this level. We're going to crank it up to 20%. We're going to go to 80%. But they're doing that not necessarily because they want to bomb. They're doing that to show on some level the weakness and the basic flaccid nature of the U.S. at this point after pushing the strategy. Because keep in mind, the U.S. didn't have to do this. He chose to do this. And now these guys are on the outs of the JCPOA trying to figure out a way to get back in. And the thing that they can't do is look weak while trying to get Iran to bite and get back in the deal. Iran knows that, which is, in part, I would suspect, why they're increasing the enrichment. It puts pressure on the U.S. to act. So it's fascinating politics. I would love to get one of these professors. I feel like kind of like the Luis Elizondo thing, that sometimes the people who go on the mainstream media are wasted on mainstream media. They should come here. they could get the better conversation and get a better thing. I'm being honest. I'm being very honest. That's not just bravado. I think that's true and borne out through our interviews. Senate Democrats are looking at an arcane budget rule to get the infrastructure agenda passed. Now, this is actually pretty fascinating and interesting politics. Joe Biden didn't necessarily want to destroy the filibuster. Okay, so is your presidency over then if you can't get it passed? Since budget reconciliation typically is only used once, what are you going to do? Well, that's just it. It's typically only used once, but that's not necessarily a flat fact of things. Keep in mind, none of this stuff is real. All of these things are just procedural rules. And in this case, there's an arcane procedural rule that would allow them to get multiple bites at the apple using budget reconciliation. So instead of it being one budget reconciliation, it's a second budget reconciliation that is really just an addendum to the first one. So it's, all right, we had our first budget, we're going to have our second one, but the second one that we're doing is still really part of the first one. We're just kind of attaching it. Now, the parliamentarian basically said, yes, you can do that. That's fair game in this process. And this allows 51 votes to pass Joe Biden's infrastructure plan, which means that once again, you're going to have Joe Biden negotiating purely with Democrats to pass this plan. Now, you may get a few Republicans to latch on, but at this point, it seems like McConnell and other Republicans are in a reflexively no standpoint, and Manchin is going to be the problem for Biden on this issue. Because Biden says he wants, 29% increase. And Manchin says, whoa, that's unworkable. Now, the other catch here that I actually give some credence to is the idea that Biden and Manchin are working in tandem. That Biden wants to seem a particular way, but he needs a limiting factor, and that limiting factor being Joe Manchin. Now, that's somewhat conspiratorial, and I have no evidence of that. And I'm almost inclined to believe that Joe Manchin and Biden are on the same page either way, where Biden just kind of knows what Manchin is going to be for and what he's going to be against, and he just plays against it. Again, I don't even know that as a flat fact. What I do know is that at the end of the day, if they can go through budget reconciliation, they can get the 51 votes in order to pass the agenda. And then the question becomes, who are you negotiating with again? And how bad it looks if you end up negotiating with yourself and negotiating yourself down. Does that make sense, Shane? Because it comes across as if the American public isn't worth X or Y when you're not willing to basically back that public. I don't know. The idea that you have that much clout and that much power, and you're able to use the 51 votes to pass your agenda, and instead of being able to kind of pass that agenda in this kind of uniform way, you end up negotiating downward. It's always negotiating down. It's never saying, hey, the American public needs more.
Isn't that just the Democrats' actual position here? I mean, it's the appearance is, they've got 50 votes in the Senate. They've got a Democrat vice president. They have it. They take by the seat of their pants, by their teeth, they have it. Where the truth is, some of the Democrats who are in there are actually more right leaning. Look specifically at Joe Manchin, and there is not a thing Joe Biden can or should be able to do about it. And it just reflects the fact that the Democrats they're not strong. They have a 0 vote majority except with the tiebreaker from Kamala. And that is actually, frankly, their position. They don't have a significant mandate. The base of who they have in Congress isn't all there with them. So they're, in that sense, a slightly more weakened party than the Democrats that you were used to from previous generations, although arguably they've gotten weaker over time.
Yeah, that part I agree with. I do think they've gotten weaker over time. And I do think from the standpoint of these guys are more right-wing. Whether Biden can do anything about it or not, that's different. I don't believe that he can't do anything about it. I just think he doesn't. It's a few points. I don't think he cares on some level about the $15 an hour minimum wage, or for that matter, whether it's a 29% or 26 or whatever Manchin says. And so you have that, where that energy is not there of urgency, that sense of urgency. I just don't think he has it in him. I mean, even if he did want to do it, I'm not even sure he could do it meaning from a standpoint of get out there and go after Manchin or bring him into the bully pulpit or bring him into the office to talk behind the scenes and that type of thing, and the gravitas of the office. I don't think he can do it. And up to this point, I haven't seen him even try. So, and before we leave, let's get the COVID count. This is the New York Times. At least 907 new coronavirus deaths and 62,004 new cases were reported in the United States on April 6. Over the past week, there's been an average of 64,847 cases per day, an increase of 19% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Wednesday morning, more than 30,870,900 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM, 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. Also, if you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So Iran and the United States are meeting for indirect talks. And this is interesting and strange because of the way the politics are working with this. There is an awesome back and forth between various people, either Jen Psaki and the people who are asking her questions in the press briefing room about Iran and the way that they ask those questions. It's like, hey, what's the stick that you're going to use against Iran? It's like, what do you mean the stick you're going to use against Iran? Or you would have the woman on CNN asking a question in such a way where she's trying to browbeat an Iranian professor saying, hey, is Iran going to come back to the deal or not? And he's making the point to him like, well, that's not really for us to say so because the U.S. is the one that pulled out the deal. And unless they want us into the deal, they need to get rid of all of the sanctions. And so then it's like she's asking him again, well, I mean, we're in a negotiation now. And since we're in this negotiation now, shouldn't Iran be willing to give some? Yeah, shouldn't Iran be willing to give some? And then he kind of makes the point of saying, well, okay, he has the clip. Okay, so let's do this. Let's just play it since it seems like the clip is available. So let's play this clip. This is CNN versus the Iranian professor. This guy's phenomenal. Look like this guy. Let's play the clip.
Iran says it will curb its nuclear activity only if all US sanctions are lifted immediately. That's not going to happen. Whether or not Joe Biden wants to do that, he is unlikely to get congressional support for any action like that. So it's not going to happen. Is there potential for a softening in that demand from Tehran?
No, absolutely not. The Iranians have signed a deal, the JCPOA, and the United States has obligations, and the Iranians have obligations. If the United States does not want to carry out its obligations, then it can't expect Iran to carry out its obligations. It's not a one-sided deal. So you can't expect Iran to do what it's supposed to do and then have the Americans not do what they are supposed to do.
But it is a negotiation. It may not be a one-sided deal, but we are back at the negotiation table, as it were. So I ask you again, can you imagine a softening of the demands by Tehran at this point?
No, because this is not a negotiation. The nuclear deal is in place. Iran will not accept any changes. Any changes to the deal will be appeasement, and the Iranians are not going to accept appeasing the United States. There have been long talks in order to get to the JCPOA. Many people in Iran think that Iran gave too much, but in any case, Iran accepted the deal. Iran abided by the deal, and unfortunately, under Obama, the U.S. violated the deal. They never implemented it in full, and of course, Trump left the deal and bullied other countries into imposing sanctions.
This is not a negotiation. This is Morandi. And look, I don't even live in Iran, and I think Iran gave too much in that deal. But they made the deal, and they made the deal for sanctions, and they could do whatever they want in regards to choosing whether or not to make a deal. They made the deal. And then you had the moderates in the country saying, we're going to get rid of the sanctions. We're going to up the economy. We're going to be more integrated into the world. Fine. We're giving up a lot, but that's okay. We're going to make the deal anyway. And then the moment that Trump comes in, he kills the deal. And not just kills the deal, goes on this pressure campaign where they are being hawkish, bringing in ships and military into the area. You have them murdering Soleimani, murdering scientists, killing various people in the country. What is the Quds Force commanders? You have a pressure campaign that is even killing people in the country itself, because what do you think sanctions are? They're an act of war. Sanctions under Bill Clinton killed 500,000 kids in Iraq. So what do you think the sanctions are doing during the COVID crisis when it is preventing them from getting access to the medications that they need for it? What do you think that's doing? And now we have this conversation where you believe that Iran should give something in this process, that they should give something outside of all of the sanctions need to be lifted before we join the deal, period. And I'm even of mind that there should be some kind of consequence for the U.S. pulling out of the deal in the first place and for everything that took place after that. Because if you're trying to get back to the deal and you're understanding that pulling out that deal was a mistake, then all of the murders, all of the killings, all of the campaign that took place after that was also a mistake. Why shouldn't there be consequences for that level of a mistake? You had all of these other countries that signed on to it. The United States signed on to it, even if it's not a treaty, so what? And you had Iran sign on to it. You have all of these signatories that signed on to the deal. The U.S. pulled out. How is it all of a sudden Iran's responsibility to come back into compliance? It's not their job to come back into compliance. It's the United States' job to come back to compliance. Because whether the U.S. realizes it or not, they're just one of many countries that was a part of that deal. They weren't the end-all be-all of that deal. They were one of many, just like Iran was one of many. And in the sense of coming into or out of compliance, the United States has certain obligations that were associated with them being part of that deal. And they failed in their obligations. Iran not only fulfilled their obligations under the deal, but did so for another year after the U.S. pulled out. And even then, they used this elegant level of politics where they said, look, under the guise of the deal or under the auspices of the deal, we can lessen our input of this deal if the other partner is not doing his job. And that's what they did. Meaning, even when pulling back from the deal, the language that they used to do that was in a political casting of, was still working with the context of the deal. No, the U.S. pulled out of that deal. The U.S. took those actions and stepped after the fact. And yet I knew as the sun was going to rise on the next day that at some point mainstream media was going to take this tact and position that it is somehow Iran's responsibility to get back into compliance with the JCPOA. as opposed to the United States' responsibility to come back into compliance with the JCPOA. It doesn't even factor into the U.S. consciousness of things that they are the ones that are in error. It doesn't even factor into the consciousness of the media that it is the U.S. that's in error. Despite the fact that they hate Donald Trump's guts from a foreign policy standpoint, they still look at this. That woman from CNN will look at that professor and say, well, aren't you going to have to give something? Isn't this a deal? Isn't this a negotiation? And to this point, there's nothing to give. You've burned the moderates. And even if there was somebody that wanted to give something, they couldn't say it aloud and retain their political standing. You have nobody else to negotiate with because you burn all of the people that would have had the potential to negotiate with you. I don't even know what the next election is going to come out as, because fact is, Rouhani took that job as the moderate. So will he get burned because of the way Iran got burned in dealing with the U.S.? And what stops a new president from coming in and blowing it away again? Shane, what are your thoughts? I mean, at the end of the day, we have this situation where we pull out of an agreement. We not just pull out of the agreement, start attacking the other party that is in the right in this agreement. The European allies who are supposed to be putting pressure on the United States to stay within the deal, I mean, that's the whole point of the +5, they turn around and shake their fist at Iran saying, you better stay with the deal. Despite the fact it was the U.S. that pulled out of the deal and added in sanctions. The partners that were supposed to protect Iran in no way could protect Iran. Like, this was, from the standpoint of Iran, a horrible deal, because not only did they stay with the auspices of the deal, they didn't get the sanction relief that they were supposed to get for being a part of it. My point, it's the U.S. that pulled out of this deal. Let's be clear. And if anybody is supposed to come back to the deal, it's supposed to be the U.S. And the only reason they're not is because they're trying to save face and they don't want to be called weak by the opposition, which is exactly what the Republican Party would do if they tried to go back to the deal in this way. Trump put them over a barrel. That's what it boils down to. And Joe Biden is now trying to find some way, some device, some mechanism that could get him and Iran back into the JCPOA without losing anything in that process for the United States. They want Iran to lose something. Iran is not going to give up anything in this because they realize that they have all the cards. What are your thoughts, Shane?
I mean, okay, so one opening thought here is Biden, as we have been talking about for a long time, is a foreign policy hawk. He might not be there with us completely, but he's there with us enough to keep doing the thing that you'd expect him to do, which is to be a foreign policy hawk. Mostly I associated that with Ukraine just because that's the most, that's the subject that I know Biden's foreign policy best on. He was effectively the Ukraine viceroy under the Obama administration, but you can see it over his 40-plus year career at this point. Here's where I'm going with that. He could have painted this as a mistake on the part of the previous administration, one that he was toughly but rightly going to try to correct by re-entering the deal, and not immediately giving in, possibly, and not giving everything, but being like, okay, let's lift some of these sanctions. Let's start talks with Iran. Maybe not even all of the sanctions, because again, that would be just a complete reversal. But you lift at least some of them, a sizable majority possibly, and then you say, okay, we've picked up our end of the stick. The ball is a little bit closer to your end of the court, Iran, and now let's talk. And instead, what we've done and what we've shown signs of continuing to do is, constantly waiting for them to pick up their end of the stick. If what Trump did here was wrong, and if Biden were willing to clearly say that, as he has about so many other things that Trump has done, we would be a lot closer to a meaningful diplomatic agreement with them. Instead, we're having indirect talks where, the American diplomats are in one hotel and all of the other members of the agreement are in another, and Iran isn't speaking directly to us. And it's like a horrible high school relationship gone wrong where you're passing notes from class to class in order to maintain a conversation with your lover. Except in this case, they're our enemy, and we kind of want to kill each other, apparently. It's not a good situation. And again, when I said the kill each other comment offhandedly, I definitely think we feel more that way about them than they do about us. But hey, words have been tough recently. It's a tense relationship. I'll put it like that. But I mean, just to put it simply, if Biden actually wanted to repair Trump's mistakes, as he said he wants to do in so many other cases, he could extend that very easily to this one. He wouldn't come off as weak. He might get some pushback from, members of the intel community and the military-industrial complex and their cohorts in the media. But who cares? He's the president. He has the prerogative to do that sort of thing, and that would be the right thing to do. This is his own bias coming into play. This is his own policy that he's setting here.
Agreed. Totally agreed. Trump messed up. Trump made a mistake pulling out of the JCPOA, and we shouldn't have done this, and so we're going back to the JCPOA. Something to that effect. Yeah, I agree with you. He may take a little hit, but so what? At this point, we did pull out the JCPOA. We did make that mistake. So, yeah. Let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are going to be back with the one and only Mark Sloboda.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So, interesting news came about yesterday. Turkish President Recep Erdogan has confirmed during talks with the head of the European Commission and European Council on Tuesday that he is committed to entering the European Union. Now, that's interesting because that would be basically the only Muslim country that is part of the European Union. He's expressed a want before, but it was unclear based on some of the conflict that Erdogan has been having with the European Union about whether or not that was going to come to pass. So earlier in the day, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Charles Michel arrived in Ankara basically on a working talk to talk about pretty much everything under the sun. Libya, Syria, Iraq, Nagorno-Karabakh, Eastern Mediterranean. They described the meeting as being positive, and these guys are in negotiations. Part of the negotiations, I would imagine, has something to do with whether or not immigrants or migrants will be staying in Turkey, and there's a deal that these guys are going to make. But the interesting part here, the interesting news, is that Turkey is committed to joining the European Union. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Mark Sloboda, an international relations and security analyst. Mark, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
Absolutely. Did I explain that correctly? Is there anything that I missed in that explanation before we go forward? I just want to make sure that I nail it down correctly.
Yeah, well, actually, Turkey has long been a candidate to join the European Union. I mean, decades now. It originally had a deal as an associate member of the Western European Union until its end. It had a customs union agreement in 1995, and it was officially recognized as a full candidate for full membership in the EU since 1999. But for more than 10 years now, there has been absolutely no movement, primarily due to the EU, on Turkey having any further steps towards joining the EU. And both the French President Macron and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel are on record in the last couple of years saying that Turkey will not or never join the EU.
Never join the EU. Well, now, why? What is their issue?
One was never. So, and certainly they made it clear that under Erdogan, Turkey will never join the EU.
Well, right there. Why? I mean, and that's kind of why this story was interesting to me, because Erdogan, from my understanding, like you said, Turkey had wanted to join the European Union. They've been talking about this forever.
Because under Erdogan, Turkey has essentially become a dictatorship. He has imprisoned hundreds of thousands since the 2016 coup against him, which he blamed on the Gulen Islamic movement. I have serious doubts about that is what really happened. But Turkey now has more journalists still imprisoned than any other country in the world. In fact, more than all other countries put together. And they just made a move in recent days to shut down the main Kurdish political party in the country, and they've removed the political status and imprisoned dozens of Turkish Kurdish members of parliament. And then there's the question of judicial independence, the attack on the media. The EU basically does not regard Turkey as a democracy anymore.
Very interesting.
And in some ways for good reason. And it's weird just looking at the relationship. Two aspects of it. One with trade, where the EU in the past couple of weeks has been talking about how they want to deepen trade. They want to, do more trade with Turkey, to put it simply. And at the same time, in that same conversation, was talking about how they would be ready to implement sanctions on Turkey if they kept going in the same humanitarian direction as they have been. And then on the other hand, you have NATO, where on the European side of things, discounting, of course, the United States, Turkey, again, pretty well-known fact at this point, last I checked, has the largest military in NATO, in Europe at this point.
Yes.
And it seems, in the post-war era, European Union, obviously a bit younger than NATO, but it seems like those two were tied at the waist. One is a political and economic alliance. The other is a military alliance tying all these countries together. It would make sense that, if there is a sort of Siamese twin relationship between those two packs, that Turkey might join up at some point. But when it comes to the politics, and increasingly when it comes to trade and economics, it seems like Turkey is doing its own thing. And the collapse of the lira over recent years hasn't been helping that. Mark, how can you fit this all together for me? And specifically NATO, that conversation, since Turkey isn't going to join the EU, at least under Erdogan, and that means for the time being, for the foreseeable future, what does that mean for NATO too? Mark, what's your take?
Yeah, I think there definitely has been of course, a symbiotic relationship between membership in the EU and membership in NATO. Quite often, membership in the EU has preceded membership in NATO, particularly in Eastern Europe. It has been the other way in some instances, particularly Turkey, which has long been an EU member. And that is simply because of the geopolitical importance that Turkey was brought into NATO earlier. The U.S. has long been pushing for the EU to accept Turkey as a member of the EU in an attempt to cement it. And we've seen recent frictions with Turkey and lots of calls into question of Turkey not living up to NATO values, and certainly with its purchase of the S-400 air defense system by Russia and the resulting U.S. sanctions against Turkey, there has been some tensions and some questions whether NATO is enough to cement Turkey properly in shall we say, the bloc Western hegemony. But there is no further movement from the EU, certainly on Turkish ascension to the EU. And they made it very clear in their meeting with Erdogan that they said human rights was the first priority. We've seen a backsliding on democracy, a lot of this usual language. In particular, this is kind of funny. Turkey just in recent weeks pulled out of the Istanbul Convention on women's rights, particularly on domestic violence against women. And the EU was not happy about this. And during the meeting in Ankara between the three of them, and this was Erdogan, the leader of the regime in Turkey, along with Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, and the EU Council President, Charles Michel. During that meeting, they sat down, and there was a center of the room, one chair for Erdogan, one chair for the EU Council President, Charles Michel, and the EU Commission President, who is usually regarded as the same rank as the EU Council President, Ursula von der Leyen, was left standing in the middle of the room, unsure of where to sit. Because it was kind of like the three of them as a relative diplomatic status equals. And eventually she was motioned over to a beige couch on the far corner of the room at a seat equivalent in distance to the Turkish foreign minister. So this is seen as a big slight and a personal slight and perhaps a feminist slight against the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and certainly did not, I think, improve a lot of relations. Of course, there's also the question of why the EU Council President Charles Michel didn't say anything or offer her his chair. He just sat down. But it was reported pretty well in the Washington Post, actually, for once, and it was. I found it particularly amusing and very characteristic of the kind of creature that Erdogan is.
What's the kind of creature he is? Let me ask you this about. Let's go with the NATO for a moment. Jen Psaki yesterday was asked a question about Ukraine and NATO. Now, considering that there's these kind of military movements and considering that there's this kind of war bubbling going on between, you could say, these two aspects of the Ukraine in which one is backed by the West, one is backed by Russia. NATO is not looking for the Ukraine to join, are they? I know Ukraine wants to join, or at the very least they expressed interest in joining back during the Obama era, but I thought that was because they wanted to have some kind of insulation and protection against losing, basically, to Russia. That's my understanding of it. But am I wrong on that? I mean, are the NATO countries looking for Ukraine to join NATO? That seems like that would be maddening. They are. That's insane.
They have been since 2008. It was actually put into NATO official documents, writing up the results of the meeting, that it was the intention of NATO to have both Georgia and Ukraine join NATO, and they would and will someday. That was the essence of the statement. Of course, not much progress has been made of that, and technically both countries have conflicts on their territories, territorial disputes, Georgia with Ossetia and Abkhazia, Ukraine now with the civil conflict with Donbass resulting from the 2014 putsch, which overthrew the democratically elected government there, the resulting civil conflict still going on in the country. But Russia is seen as the instigator of both of those conflicts, at least from the NATO perspective. I would be very surprised if push came to shove and there was a political decision that we need to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO now, that they would not choose to waive that requirement. I believe that would be waived if there was the political will. There isn't quite the political will right now, of course, because of Russia's reaction. Russia has made very clear that it would see either Ukraine or Georgia entering into official NATO accession protocols to be a national security red line issue. I mean, that would be like the equivalent of, say, Canada and Mexico joining, an anti-American military alliance, with China and Russia or something of the sort. It's a maybe a problematic comparison, but there it is from the Russian perspective. But in recent days, the comedian turned president of the regime in Kiev, Zelensky, has basically pleaded for Ukraine to be given a ascension path to joining, a concrete ascension path to joining NATO now, saying that only by joining NATO can the political differences in the country, the conflict with East Ukraine, be resolved. I think that actually would definitely make the situation far more tense and worse, but he sees it as an attempt to try to draw NATO militarily into his civil conflict.
That is unfortunate, because I think that would start a war.
Yes, it most definitely would.
Yeah. That's why I was like, it's maddening that they would want them in NATO. I mean, like, especially considering everything that's taking place. It is a massive jump.
It's all about hegemonic geopolitical consolidation. That is why, Macedonia and Montenegro and all these other, countries that do not contribute to the military security of NATO per se, but it is more about, geopolitical consolidation.
Yeah, but there should be some kind of understanding of self-preservation. Like, it's meaning it's one thing if you can win. There's no winning that war. So it's like, why provoke a conflict that you can't win, unless it's a certain degree of brinksmanship thinking where the other party is not going to respond in this way, and which means you're just sleepwalking your way into a conflict.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that is the thinking from the West. Yes.
The voice that you guys are listening to is Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at MarkSloboda1 and find him on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. And we're going to be back with Mark in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are and continue to be joined by Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, thank you again for sticking with us. I want to kind of pivot onto what you were talking about towards the end of the segment there. You moved to Ukraine. Let's talk about that for a bit. I also want to get into the recently restarted, although indirect talks between Iran and the United States, and of course the other members of the JCPOA. But really, it's Iran and the U.S. But first, let's talk about Ukraine for a minute. I know you were on the show last Friday, helping Jamarl out while I took a day off, and thank you for doing that. And you guys were talking Ukraine. It seems like not too much has changed over the weekend. More stories have come out about it, and this might be a good opportunity to talk about the EU and Ukraine. Pivoting off of what you were talking about there, when Ukraine has suppressed opposition political parties that they call pro-Russian and shut down multiple TV stations now, often those kinds of moves would be seen as domestic political repression and decried by Western powers, including the EU, including the US. And yet I'm guessing it's getting a warm welcome. Are those moves, along with the troop movements towards their eastern border, are those sort of like reconciliatory moves that Zelensky is trying to make with the EU specifically and with the United States specifically? Do you see those as independent plays? I'm guessing you would assume he's getting some direction there from outside forces, but specifically on the conversation of joining the EU and maybe even NATO, are those like, welcoming gifts into that process, trying to get that process going? How do you see them, Mark?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, why you're not seeing anything, right? Yeah, do not expect fireworks tomorrow, because the military situation, if there was going to be an offensive by Kiev against Donbass, or the way the Western mainstream media is presenting it, a Russian invasion of Ukraine, it wouldn't take place for a few weeks yet, because the territory here in Russia and Ukraine is still coming out of winter. And the territory is quite melting, and mud is a very serious issue in Russia and Ukraine in the spring. And it's just not a militarily good time to launch anything, certainly that has a ground component. So if there is going to be something, don't expect it until the end of April through July. That would be the ideal time for any military move in that regard. As towards the issues of Ukraine joining the EU or NATO, the Ukraine's economy is not in a good situation. I mean, in the last since the 2014 putsch, they have become, on a per capita basis, the poorest country in Europe, the poorer than Moldova, and that's saying something. And they certainly have not had any better economic time because of the coronavirus pandemic. So Ukraine at the moment is quite far away from joining the EU. And even on the EU partnership agreement, which was the whole reason that the Ukrainian government was overthrown in 2014, this EU association agreement, which Yanukovych, actually pushed and lobbied for. But then when he saw the final, 1,000 pages of neoliberal shock therapy diktat with no money to help ameliorate the effects, and we're talking tens of millions unemployed from state companies and mass privatization, he said, no, we can't do this, not now, not without some money, and let's see what the Russians have to offer. And then, he was overthrown, with EU and American politicians, literally on the stage in Kiev, cheerleading people that were overthrowing, calling for the overthrow of the government. So there's no coincidence there. But since then, as of a couple years ago, Ukraine had only completed 23% of the steps according to that EU association agreement. I do not believe that much progress has been made since then. And that 23% was the low-hanging fruit. All of the big political costs, the mass privatization of state companies, the digging up of, literally, I mean, they require, the EU association agreement requires the complete self-destruction of Ukraine and rebuilding from the ground up, including ripping the very railroad tracks out of the ground and replacing them with EU-compatible railroad tracks. But anyway, not much of it has been met, and what has been met was the low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff, and that's because the political toll and the economic suffering that would result from completing that EU association agreement, no Ukrainian president, Yanukovych, couldn't agree to even, formally implementing it. Poroshenko agreed to it, but then never implemented it. And Zelensky hasn't made any further progress in implementing it either. And if they can't even complete an EU association agreement, not by a long stretch, then certainly any talk of them joining the EU within the next 2 decades seems extremely unlikely. In fact, there would be a higher likelihood, I think, if this bring NATO right up to Russia's borders mentality continues in Washington and Brussels, then it would be more likely to see the disastrous, I think it would be disastrous, but a push to have Ukraine join NATO sometime in the next decade. I hope that doesn't happen, but I think it's actually more likely than Ukraine joining the EU at any point in the near future.
What's wild about that is we were willing to destroy the world with the idea of missiles being put in Cuba. Like, to put that in perspective, like the conversation that Kennedy was having with, I believe it was Eisenhower, where he was asking him whether or not Khrushchev was really going to launch, and he's telling him, no, that's not going to happen, he's never going to do it. And then you find out later that the order had already been given that if the U.S. attacks to launch, he would have ended the world. And it's like that just basic recognition of areas of sovereignty, and not just areas of sovereignty, in the way that countries can be dicey about being around their borders, considering that the country has been invaded twice with tens of millions of people being killed in those invasions. It just seems like it doesn't filter through. And when we talk about it here, there's always the dropping of context to explain a contextual understanding of it. Because if you give a contextual understanding, they may come to a conclusion that's different from the one that you want them to have. From the standpoint of how is Russian media talking about this? Because you're in Moscow. And on top of that, Joe Biden has made the point of saying that the U.S. is going to back the Ukraine. Well, what does that mean? Or what do you think that means? So I guess that question is in two parts. How is Russian media explaining the troop movements and the things that are taking place between in the Ukraine right now and the potential for Russian investment in it? How is it being described and explained in Moscow? But on top of that, what do you think they mean by, we're going to back the Ukraine in this process?
Well, one thing that the Russian media is certainly talking about right now, and it's funny you brought it up. You brought up the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right now, the Russian foreign minister made a recent statement, and there's a lot of talk in the press here that in recent days there is increasing talks between Washington and the EU about the deployment of short and intermediate range ballistic missiles to Europe. If you'll remember, the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the INF Treaty, and Russia, of course, followed afterwards. The EU wasn't too hot on it at the time, but now Washington is pushing EU on the deployment of short and intermediate range missiles in Europe. And Russia is extremely upset about this and says that if it goes forward, they will have to respond. So we are, there's not talk right now whether those will be nuclear or conventional, but of course Russia would see either one, of course, as a military threat, albeit of one military, one strategic. And that is, a return to Cuban Missile Crisis type situation, this time with, U.S. missiles, short and intermediate range missiles in very close proximity to Russia, deployed in Europe. Of course, the talk in Russia is that war is coming and that there is an attempt by the regime in Kiev, the Westpac regime in Kiev, and Washington to try to restart the frozen conflict in East Ukraine and draw Russia overtly into that conflict. Well, at the same time, the Western mainstream media is talking about Russia invading Ukraine.
That is indeed what they're talking about. And you say frozen conflict. It was just a short time ago, just with a year or two ago at this point, that it seemed like they were opening up for talks. And admittedly, the talks were stalled on, the resolution of that crisis, whatever that looked like with the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. But regardless, that's where we were. And now Biden is in. And, the policies that he pursued and that he enacted under Obama, I'm sure many people in his administration, many people in the military complex here in the States, they're all acting that stuff out. And so we're seeing that come back to light. We got about 20 seconds, but is that broadly right, Mark? Is this Biden specifically, in other words?
Yeah, and Kiev is seeing this, of course, as a green light. Biden has a long history there, and Biden even brought the neocon Victoria Nuland, infamous for being one of the orchestrators of the putsch from the American side in 2014. She's the wife of the arch neocon Robert Kagan. And the fact that Biden brought her back into his administration is being read in Moscow that Biden intends to escalate in Ukraine.
And that, I'm sure, is a correct reading. And you can see it You can see it being revealed as correct very clearly with what's happening over the past month. We need to close this one out. We were joined for this segment and the last by Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst, a frequent guest on the show, and I'm glad to have him. Mark, thank you for joining us. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of today's show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe, welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, sometimes independent even of corners, I am your political analyst, Jane Stranahan.
Looking for the corner in a circular room? Welcome to Fault Lines. All right, so let's get to the headlines. I got to be honest, that Mark is always a great guy to have on for conversation, but that is a worrying conversation. I'll just say that, because when I think of politics, I learned a lot of my stuff learning through wars. I was always fascinated by them, just the toll that takes, the things that people are willing to give in order to kind of win. And what does it even mean in the context of winning if you lose hundreds of thousands of people and so forth? And so when I look at this stuff, I have somewhat of a bias towards looking at it in those terms that I try not to necessarily be overly hysterical about. But the Cold War was a real thing. And in the context of these guys potentially killing each other, there were situations where they almost accidentally kill one another. I mean, the entire point of the missile treaties was to give people enough space and time to ensure that it's not a mistake, for one, and for communication, second. And that was torched. And in the same way that it was a mistake to pull out the JCPOA, yeah, it's a mistake to do that. Look, I get that the United States believes that it can be as boisterous as it likes, and that the level of bravado can, go to infinity. But other countries have a history also. And in the context of those other countries with their histories, if they have issues with their borders, in the same way that the U.S. has issues with its borders, we would not accept a hostile foreign force being either on Mexico or Canada. And we would even probably have issue if it was a hostile foreign force that was just friends with the government, to put that in perspective. And so this ever push to continuously expand NATO till it gets to the borders of Russia. And then the media in the U.S. is going to immediately turn around and say, well, Russia is being aggressive. I guarantee you that's what they're going to do. Meaning we propagate wars. We create our monsters. And then we have this
That's what they're already doing. That's
right. They're doing it now.
What they're already doing. Yeah.
And then they would turn around and say, these guys are being aggressive. These guys are being aggressive.
Yeah,
I can't believe they're defending themselves. It's astonishing.
Troop movements on the Baltic states, or even troop movements as we're seeing now on the border with Ukraine, really the border with the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. But hey, that's what we're talking about. That is exactly, we're seeing that this weekend, where if you go and look up Ukraine troop movements, what you could see is the ones that Ukraine has been doing over the past month and a half. But what you will see inevitably, first and only, is what Russia has been doing, which is, again, a response to what Ukraine was doing, along with its allies in the U.S. and the EU.
Yeah, that's the context that they draw. It's just, look, I always say that part of the reason that I do this job, that gets me up in the morning, is to try to provide context. We're honest actors in this. And trying to say, look, this is the contextual point, or this is, if you're sitting on the moon looking at events, this is what it looks like. And people can make a choice on that. They can look at that and say, based on their own value system and the things that they value and not, they can come away and say, hey, the U.S. is entirely right to do that. That's their choice. But at the very least, they should have enough context to try to make that choice. And it seems over and over again that media functions in a way of not allowing that. The closer, and honestly, man, the more it deviates, or the more how our actions deviate from this expressed model of our actions, like the best aspect of us, then the way that this image and everything that we portray, the more our actions deviate from that, the more you could see the lie about this stuff. Look, I don't want a war, period. I don't think there's a way to even win that war. And even if you're talking about winning it, I don't even know what that means in the context of something that will most likely turn into a nuclear conflict. And so, yeah, and what they will probably say is, we're going to use short-range nukes. That's what we're going to do. And then that's not going to escalate at all. It's going to be that nonsense. Like, this is the reason why I pushed Sloboda, and I was asking him, like, there's no way they could want the Ukraine to join under these circumstances, because it's going to go immediately into conflict. Meaning the only reason that the Ukraine would want to join is to try to say, all right, you're not going to hit us and you're not going to touch us now that we're part of NATO. That's their point. That's the reason they want to do it. But you would think that the other countries would not want them in NATO for that very explicit reason also. Meaning just because you want to put pressure on a country doesn't necessarily mean you want to provoke a war with that country. Those are different things. But yeah, that takes rational actors. Let's get to the headlines. At least 970 new coronavirus deaths and 62,004 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 64,847 cases per day, an increase of 19% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 30,870,900 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 556,000 have died from it. Teams from Iran, the United States, and members from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement, the JCPOA, often known as the Iran nuclear deal, met in hotels in Vienna, Austria, to agree to talks to the United States and Iran returning to the deal, which former President Donald Trump pulled out of in May 2018. Now, they've agreed to the creation of two working groups. One is designed to bring the United States back into the deal by dropping sanctions on Iran. The other focus is on how to bring Iran back into compliance with the deal limits on nuclear enrichment and stockpiles of enriched uranium. Truth of the matter is, the second one is easy as pie. Meaning, Iran has been very clear that if you drop the sanctions, we'll come back to the deal. Now, they are better than I am, because I wouldn't come back to the deal if they dropped the sanctions. I would need some other sweetening element because of all of the damage and chaos and the killings that took place in between those times. Meaning, how can there not be compensation when one country pulled out of the deal and then decided to take aggressive, provocative actions after the fact? If you admit that the actions were wrong, and maybe therein lies the problem. Whereas it's easy for Iran to basically go back to what their typical level of enrichment was because they weren't trying to have nuclear weapons anyway. The United States has this problem of saving face. How does it save face in the situation? We pull out the deal. We upped the pressure strategy. We said that our express goal was to basically get them to come back to the deal to make another agreement that was that much worse for them than the deal that they already signed. And we failed to accomplish that. That's just the bare bones of it. At this point, Iran is enriching, almost showing the weakness and the flaccidness of the United States in the way that it's upping their enrichment, and the U.S. can't really do anything about it because Donald Trump has already tried to do everything when he was in office. Meaning the issue of the threat looming much heavier than the act itself. Right here. It's one thing to have a threat in regards to getting something accomplished, but Donald Trump didn't just use a threat, he used all the tools in his toolbox and it came up for naught. So now these guys are trying to get back to the deal. And the U.S., by my assessment, is trying to save face while doing it. And I don't know how they're going to pull that off. Iran is not going to give anything on that, nor should they in this situation. But we'll see. We will see. The IMF has raised its forecasts for the global economy for this year and the next as fallout from the coronavirus may be fading. Its forecast for the next year of global economic growth is now 6%, a record in IMF records dating back to 1980. In 2022, the IMF predicts the growth will decelerate to a still significant 4.4% rate. Pro-democracy protesters in Myanmar sprayed red paint on road signs and bus signs to symbolize spilled blood by the coup regime. Keep in mind, the protesters have not accepted the notion that the military junta, if you want to call it, is taking power. This has been a fascinating conflict for people who are interested in just politics in and of itself. You basically had a situation where Suu Kyi, who had been in house detention for God knows how many years, she becomes the president of that country. And in being the leadership of that country, you have a situation, well, I'm not going to say president, I'm going to say the leader of the country. But within the context of that, you have the military that also still has a huge amount of clout and power in the politics and affairs of that country. And what you find is this kind of dance of sorts where she is the democratic aspect of the government that is trying to mitigate and undermine the militaristic aspect of that government until it gets to the point where the military responds and tries to take it all. And it's this question becomes, who has more clout? The guy with the democracy or the guy with the gun? And in this case, it seems that the question is unclear. The guy with the gun is definitely out there, but the people who want democracy aren't moving, they haven't gone anywhere, and it doesn't necessarily seem like they're going anywhere. Pay attention to that conflict.
And here's the other side of this too. I mean, two other things to bring in here. You say the guy with the gun, and that is true. The coup regime has plenty of guns, but so do all the ethnic minorities that, as we've talked about with our guests frequently, KJ No, he's told us, you have all of these different ethnic minority groups. The country has been mired in civil war for decade after decade after decade for a decade, which means those groups have built up not only their own armaments, but literally their own armament factories. They have their own supply lines running and their own sizable militias that they can use if and when they decide to enter into this conflict. And so far, the Kachin is the group that is most pronouncedly entered into this, basically very clearly signaling their allegiance with the protest movement against the coup government. This came as last weekend, more than 100 people were killed on a single day on Saturday, and the bloodiest day yet. And on that same day, the coup regime struck Karen territories, another ethnic minority group in the east of the country along the Thai border, struck Karen territories, forcing thousands to flee across the Thai border. And you can guess that doesn't make the Karen feel any better. They have their own militias. In other words, you have all, and I'm leaving out literally dozens of other groups with significant armaments in many cases, significant armed forces. If and when they decide to get into this armed conflict, you will now have two sides with guns. And so instead of it being merely a show of unity by protesters, there's the potential for an acceleration of what was a long-run civil war into an even, more intensified one. Yeah. Exactly. And then the other side of this that's also worth bringing up from an American perspective, Myanmar is a hugely important country bordering China, which would give China and its Belt and Road Initiative another seaside port, effectively, another way of exporting and importing goods through another means. And whereas they would have been bottlenecked through the South China Sea, which if they ever got into some kind of hot conflict with the United States, would be a trade bottleneck that the U.S. could use its carrier groups and stuff to suppress and effectively implement a blockade. They would now have, if they were to continue with this deal with Myanmar, if everything is smooth sailing from here on out, they would have another way in and out of their country. So from the U.S. perspective, this is also a big deal. From China's perspective, this is hugely important. How this goes is significant. So far, they don't seem to have been intensely involved. And frankly, nor does the U.S. It's just an ongoing, still largely national insular conflict that eventually, sometime not too long from now, could bring in not just international attention, but international military involvement in a much bigger way. We'll see how that happens. We'll be covering it for 30.
Yeah, initially
we need to close this one out, though.
Yeah, let's close it. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We have a fantastic interview coming up. The MeToo movement, to put it mildly, was earth-shattering in the United States. But after several years out, there's a question about the efficacy and whether or not it actually had a lasting impact. One of those cases, at the very least, holds a mirror up to our society, was with Tara Reade. She's joining us today to have a conversation, and I think it's an interesting conversation and one that needs to be had to give some kind of retrospective on where we are as a society, whether or not the MeToo movement actually did what it set out to do. The voice that you guys are about to hear is Tara Reade. She's an author, former Senate aide, survivor, animal rights activist, actress, and poet. Her new book, Left Out When the Truth Doesn't Fit In, covers the aftermath of the re-victimization of speaking out about the sexual assault with Senator, now President, Joe Biden in 1993. Tara, once again, I appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start off just with the basic question. You put in the re-victimization from the standpoint of Biden. And just so people can understand, back in 1993, you make the point that Biden sexually assaulted you. Now, there was all sorts of cooperating evidence for this, so it wasn't something that could just be pushed away. There were people that you told about this. So from the standpoint of whether or not there was legitimizing evidence, in a way to use the word, it was clearly there, especially more so than even something like a Kavanaugh case that Democrats went bananas over. It wasn't just the re-victimization from the standpoint of Biden, but it was also Democrats. You were relentlessly and viciously attacked. And this was like immediately after the MeToo movement, where it seems like the MeToo movement didn't apply. What are your thoughts? I mean, what did you experience when you came out with this story? Because you didn't receive a safe space. You received the opposite of that safe space.
That's a good point. No, I did not receive a safe space at all. And that was what was so ironic. Joe Biden's campaign was making announcement and other Democrats about how it takes courage and how they want to make sure there's a safe space for women to come forward. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Joe Biden was weaponizing a social media army of trolls to go after me, and that's been well documented now. One of those trolls was revealed to be paid quite a bit of money over a period of 2 months for this super PAC called Really America. And I think it was like $30,000 to $40,000. And he also smeared Cuomo survivors as well, back down and then apologized. He still has not apologized to me. But Joe Biden's campaign was also entangled with Time's Up. And I had gone to Time's Up for assistance when I was coming forward with my story. And Time's Up is an organization that has about $28 million to help women coming forward about sexual assault or sexual harassment. And in particular, if the person is powerful, they have a program that does public relations. In other words, helps people that have to face publicity deal with that, because as a normal American citizen, you don't deal with the media in that regard, professionally. And I went through the process of trying to work with Time's Up. Come to find out that Anita Dunn was hired by Joe Biden's campaign. They didn't tell me. There was a conflict of interest. I shared with them all the information about the assault and about the sexual harassment. And they still didn't tell me there was a conflict of interest. And of course, didn't help me. And then Ryan Grimm at The Intercept broke that story. So that was the first portion of the story that came forward before even the assault portion, which came forward on the Katie Halper show when I did that interview. What was stunning is that Joe Biden basically weaponized a public relations campaign against me to assassinate my character, to, discredit me. And the FEC report showed that his campaign spent about $2.2 million to date. Now, Anita Dunn is the senior White House advisor to Joe Biden. So it was very difficult, and I was very naive about the media. And basically I was used for target practice, as you know, all summer by the New York Times and Washington Post. They quickly weaponized this story and made the investigation all about me. There was no investigation into Joe Biden, and there was definitely no safe space.
And there's a different aspect to the story that I want to come back to. Your transition from being a Democrat into becoming an independent, which I'm sure was partly due to your reflection on this process and seeing long-term corruption, a long-term cover-up of your case. And I'm guessing, and I would ask you, a deeper sense of disgust that this is how this issue is being handled for you, the assumption that this is how this issue has been handled for so many others. We're seeing this with Cuomo, but coming back to your case, how did you move? What's your political perspective? What party do you identify with, if any, at this point? And how has that changed as you've had to deal with this personal crisis that's become a larger political crisis? Tara.
Well, I think, in terms of, political parties, I feel politically homeless right now, essentially. I am progressive in my views, and I'm an independent, but, like you said, I was a Democrat all my life. I was, Lucy Flores called herself a Democratic foot soldier. I would describe myself as very dedicated. I was, a person that not only just voted Democrat, but I was working for Democrats. I worked for Leon Panetta. I worked for a state senator that was a Democrat. I did a congressional race. I was in the trenches, so to speak, in that regard. And I believed in the bigger policies. However, the foreign policy always disturbed me, and I'm anti-imperialist, and I don't like the predatory behavior of the United States in countries that are more vulnerable, and just trying to create enemies out of countries that don't want to be enemies by justifying the military-industrial complex. Spending $1 trillion or more on military, and while defense contractors line their pockets, it became more and more obvious that that was not where I wanted to go. And the Democratic Party started to drift more and more. I think from the time I worked in D.C., it got more sharply right, if you will, and more sharply hawkish. That was my observation, at that age. But also, when I worked for Joe Biden, being sexually harassed in a U.S. senator's office, I was disgusted by that. And I had tried to go through protocol, went to my supervisor, another supervisor, to the chief of staff, filed an outside complaint, and I was sexually assaulted. Now, as many of you know from the Megyn Kelly interview, which I go into details about the assault, you know that it was sudden, it was unexpected, and my mother, I told that right after it happened, wanted me to go to the police. I had called her, and she was in California at the time, and I did not go to the police. And in retrospect, I wish I would have. But I did tell, other people around me. I was very traumatized by it, not only by what happened, by what he said to me. And also when I was trying to get help, I was really shut down in various ways. And then when I came forward in 2019, I came forward about the sexual harassment with the other 7 women that came forward about Joe Biden and his inappropriate behavior and unwanted touching and such. And I, again, wanted to talk about the assault, but got really shut down. I was called a Russian asset or agent by Isaac Dovere of The Atlantic. And that marginalized my story to the point where, you know, when I reached back out to Lisa Lair at the New York Times, I said, look, I want to talk about something else. She's acknowledged that I did reach out to her and that she didn't respond because she was kind of among those journalists that heard from Isaac Dovere that I was a Russian. I was just ignored then. And so I decided to go to Time's Up. And so that's sort of the path I took. I was very kind of lost as to how to come forward in a safe way. And then I just realized there was no safe way.
Wait, so just to be clear, they were able to denigrate a legitimate claim, and this is, again, after the Me Too movement, just by saying Russian disinfo. And at that point, everybody can go home and ignore what happened to you. That's astonishing. But look, that has been what's been happening, and the way that these guys have been talking about it, and the way they've been able to dismiss pretty much anything under that banner. Time's Up is interesting only because Time's Up was supposed to be an advocacy group to work in the interests of women in the very specific situation to which you tried to get them to act. And instead, they were basically working on behalf of the person who was the accused abuser. That's an astonishing case that these guys were intimately linked in that way. Do you think this is the case, or this is norm? Like, all sorts of women often have these experiences, and basically they're either blocked because of who that person is, or for that matter, not having anybody to go to the system and going forward. Meaning, do you think that the story is more normal than not? And the outcome of the story is more normal than not? And more importantly, what were you thinking after coming out of the Me Too movement and then seeing the way they treated your story? Was there a certain, I don't know what's the word for it, disorientation with this is the way the media is talking about sexual assault and how bad it is, and the Me Too movement and how women have more agency in coming out and more of a safe space? And yet they gave you a wall. Like they were very clear that no, we're not going to have this conversation about Joe Biden. And more importantly, why do you think they responded so viscerally to your story about Biden? And again, your story has all sorts of credibility going all the way through it, far more than, let's say, Kavanaugh. And to make this question more apropos, we had people like Kamala Harris. We had people like Elizabeth Warren. We had all of these Democrats saying, we must believe the woman. AOC, all of them, full bore. Kavanaugh is guilty of sin, and he is so guilty that he needs to be ripped out of the Supreme Court seat and not allowed to do it. And then we get to you. And all of those people, all of those smooth talkers had nothing to say. Nothing to say. How disorienting is that? And what did you think about all of those women that came forward in Democratic politics for, let's say, Kavanaugh, or for that matter, Trump? And then Joe Biden comes in with his own list of abusers. And I've heard people even make the argument, well, Donald Trump raped X number of women, and Biden only has 2 rape allegations. Even that started to come up as part of the conversation. What did you think about that? And what were some of these people basically saying to you in response to what the Democrats in attack that these guys have took for it?
Well, the lesser of 2 evils is still evil, as the saying goes, right? I mean, it was stunning. I saw things I never thought I'd see from people that I supported. I mean, you have to understand too, some of these people I worked with, it was a betrayal on a level I can't even describe. I discovered that there were people I knew in my life that were paid to say bad things about me. And I think it's going to take me a long time to process all the amount of betrayals. I mean, because I have been as kind of a very active citizen in my democracy, and very active in politics. And I feel a cognitive dissonance, definitely. Like you were saying, this disorientation, I would go further. It's this cognitive dissonance of, like, I believe these ideals of, a fair minimum wage, of environmental policies and all of these different things. And then these same people that I would normally agree with are calling me basically a liar, either not saying anything or calling me like Stacey Abrams, just flat out saying that I wasn't telling the truth, although she had never talked to me. And, AOC, Elizabeth Warren, even Bernie Sanders, I reached out to every single one of them before I went public and tried to get help. And, it's not like I was a random person reaching out with some story. I had records and written things that I said, hey, I would like your help. I reached out and, I'm former staff. Not a word. There was no answer. Elizabeth Warren, I think, sent me a campaign like fundraiser thing in response.
It's like, hey, I'm being molested or I was assaulted by Joe Biden. Well, hey, can you donate to our campaign?
Right. Well, yeah, I didn't put it in so many terms, but I put it like you knew something happened and I was wanting to talk to someone. I was reaching out. So it was very difficult to get help. We're in what I've come to realize is that America has institutionalized rape culture. What you said earlier about how they were comparing how many politicians, how many rapes they had, that's so craven. That's so disgusting. But that really says a lot about where we are. There was such a demonization of Trump that it didn't matter who the Democratic candidate was or what they did. They were going to rally around this person that they decided in the back rooms with the cigars who was going to run. And that was Joe Biden. And Joe Biden's entanglement with DuPont, Bristol Myers Squibb, and some of the international corporations are very well known. And, it's not like he was popular. It's, and if you talk to people, they were not even wanting to vote for him. And there was a big movement for another candidate, Bernie Sanders and some others. And basically the Democratic elites went away from 40% of the base, I believe, of the base progressives and who would have supported someone else. It was really hard to watch. It was hard to experience. When I was coming forward to backtrack just a minute, in January to Time's Up and whatnot, Joe Biden was rumored to be dropping out. And apparently that was just a rumor. It was never going to happen. But people believed it. I believed it. He was going to drop out of the race. And so I thought I was coming forward with the safety of the MeToo movement, which you mentioned initially, which that's political roadkill now. The MeToo movement doesn't exist. The hypocrisy on the Democratic Party is so strong that it's become laughable, and you've seen, pundits talk about it, and they're trying to just pretend like I don't exist. So at first they tried to, assassinate my credibility and my character. Then I was threatened with, they said that I lied about my education, which I did not. That extended to me being maybe charged with felony perjury.
Let's get into that after the break, because that's a really good case. I mean, like that was shocking when you mentioned that to me, that they were basically trying to get you to shut up by threatening you with prosecution. That's in and of itself. That's profound.
The Me Too movement was started actually because it was so hard for Black women to come forward by Tarana Burke, and then it was kind of hijacked by Alyssa Milano, who works, with Joe Biden's campaign, and Alyssa Milano was very involved with the Kavanaugh, hearing, very outspoken. There were pictures of her crying at the hearing, and then when it came to me, of course, that all went to the wayside. So the Me Too movement, I think, was just, it was more optics. There was nothing behind it. There was no real movement. There was no real commitment to that. Democrats have shown again and again that they're using the mantle of Me Too as a protection to shield the fact that they're actually enabling predators and empowering them.
Let's do this. Let's take a break. We're going to come back with more Tara Reade. Tara, that is a profound story. I mean, just having to live through that and deal with that once in 93 and then having to deal with it twice by political actors saying that you're lying, by the guy who did it, getting all of these accolades to the point of going into the office of the presidency, and all of the minions that are around that screamed, we care about women's rights, always believe the woman, etc., especially Alyssa Milano, was willing to toss you overboard at a whim And Rose McGowan ate her alive for that very level of duplicity. The voice that you guys are listening to is Tara Reade. She's an author, former Senate aide, survivor, animal rights activist, actress, and a poet. Her new book, Left Out, When the Truth Doesn't Fit, covers the aftermath of the re-victimization of speaking out about the sexual assault with Senator, now President, Joe Biden in 1993. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're continuing to be joined with Tara Reade. Tara Reade is an author, former Senate aide, survivor, animal rights activist, actress, and a poet. Her new book, Left Out, When the Truth Doesn't Fit In, covers the aftermath of the re-victimization of speaking out about the sexual assault with Senator, now President, Joe Biden in 1993. Before we left, you noted about a lawsuit, and this is astonishing. Please explain to us. They were basically trying to use this lawsuit to get you to shut up about coming out about sexual assault. Like, it went to this level. It wasn't just hiding stuff from the standpoint of the New York Post, where Joe Biden giving people this kind of fair hearing about, all right, here's the information about Hunter, here are potential crimes that Hunter committed in association with Biden. All of that was off the table. All of that was kept in the black, with mainstream media and social media working in tandem. But it wasn't just that. When your story came out, it even went to threatening criminal prosecution in order to get you to shut up about what happened in 93. Please continue.
Well, yes, it wasn't exactly a lawsuit. It was a criminal investigation. I later found out that there were sealed search warrants given to my college by the Monterey District Attorney. Now, bear in mind, I was an expert witness for domestic violence victims for the Monterey County District Attorney for several years, and I had a very positive relationship with them. And in fact, my testimony led to some positive things in the newspaper at the time of outcomes of educating juries about the cycle of violence in domestic violence situations, intimate partner situations. And it was as if, part of the destruction of my life was also destroying my career, not only just destroying my credibility, but like wiping off any good things that I did in my life. That's how it felt from my perspective. And when they said that I lied about my education, they then extended, there was a group of defense attorneys and a group of trolls kind of led by like that Kranz-Scene Sally Albright crowd. They went and did an email campaign to the DA to insist that they investigate me for felony perjury.
Wow.
That went on, and it would have been several counts of felony perjury that would have resulted in prison had I been convicted. It was very frightening. I didn't have the resources for a criminal defense attorney. I didn't really know how to deal with it. And, I didn't lie about my education. All of that was untangled. I got an attorney, and I was able to come to a mutual agreement with my college. And Ryan Grimm actually did a deep dive into this in The Intercept just recently. And he even went so far as going on Rising and called out the New York Times and asked them to correct the record, and other Politico and others for AP for misstating that I lied about, my education, and that this wasn't true. No one to date has corrected the record. I've had an attorney contact media outlets to request that they do. We'll see what happens, but thus far, no one has. So in essence, I came through it, but it was several months of being in fear. They were also online. People were asking for me to be locked up for other reasons. They wanted me to be locked up for being a Russian agent. They wanted me to be locked up for, any kind of federal wire charges they could do. It was really ugly. And meanwhile, the Democrats were out in front of cameras saying it's safe for women to come forward. Well, I can tell you, I'm a poster child of how it's not safe. And one of the things I want to do is make it safe, make it safer. So I've been, one of the people that supported me early on, who before she was really public, was Lindsay Boylan, who came forward about Cuomo. And they started to smear.
Interesting.
Yeah. And she came out, I think, in May and April, tweeting about me. Anyway, we communicated via social media a few times, and I supported her. She supported me. And then she finally decided to come forward in the way that she did about her experience with Cuomo. But I was very nervous for her, and I made it very clear. I kind of did preemptive strikes. And Rose McGowan, as you mentioned.
She has been phenomenal on this subject, by the way. And she's been very clear. She's been consistent. And she's even, what's her name? Milano alive on this subject.
Oh, yeah, several times. And Rose was really helped me. She did the foreword to my book. So she's in that. And she has been an unending sense of support as far as and advice of what I was going to deal with. Because Harvey Weinstein went after her much in the same way Joe Biden's gone after me. Coincidentally, Anita Dunn and Harvey Weinstein were connected. She advised Harvey Weinstein.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So back to the original thing. I am now clear of any charges. Of course, the Monterey DA came out and said they are not going to be charging me with felony perjury. My education was found that I did not lie about my education. And a lot of those things were backtracked, but of course, none of that is in mainstream media. So it's like, here, we're just going to destroy your life for a third time, but we're not going to correct the records. So.
Well, and on the press, I want to focus on that for a minute. I mean, you had a chance to experience the power, the veracity, and the negligence of a lot of the press. You've already named several names here, whether we're talking about Isaac DeVere on the sort of bad side of the column, or Ryan Grimm, Katie Halper on the good side of the column in terms of people who were helpful and honest. How has this series of relationships and this longer process affected how you view the press as an institution? And if you could name, good names, bad names, just for the sake of anybody watching this, for them to know, for them to support people who do good work, who has been bad and who has been good, from your perspective, Tara.
Yeah, I will. I didn't realize, I had heard how partisan our media had become. And, it's like something that kind of floats around in your mind as a citizen, right, as an American. But you don't expect to have, the major players like the Washington Post and the paper of record, the New York Times, come after you the way they came after me. That was, or like Politico calling me a manipulative, user. And remember that headline? Just one article after another. It was really something. So I would say that what I discovered was the independent and international journalists were very much more trauma informed, much better. I've received a lot of support from Australian journalists, like Australia 60 Minutes did a deep dive and was very kind of just straightforward, objective. Megyn Kelly, as you know, she's an independent. She doesn't like corporate overlords, so she's independent. She was very good. Ryan Grimm, of course, is excellent. I don't know him very well, but he is an amazing investigative journalist and has now done 2 pieces on me, or maybe even 3. And Rich McHugh was amazing, who was a writing partner for Ronan Farrow for, Catch and Kill, for the Weinstein, and was also in his book, Catch and Kill, and they expose NBC. Rich McHugh has a lot of integrity. He's not interested in politics. He's interested in the truth. And so is Ronan Farrow. And those are good journalists as far as being objective. RT International has been they handled my story at one point. They were very careful how they handled it, and I appreciated that. In other words, they didn't exploit it. They gave me dignity and a platform to present it. And that was really, really good. As far as the media goes, it's become like the fourth estate in the sense that these powerful politicians with public relations agencies and money are now able to kind of weaponize. And the danger of that is you can weaponize against an American citizen like me with no resources and eviscerate them. So whistleblowers have a really difficult time now coming out. And Julian Assange is an example of how our government goes after whistleblowers.
That's a really good example. Let me ask you this. The Lindsay Bolin thing, was that something that was already known, that you had communications with Bolin just before she came out with Cuomo, or is that new information?
I mean, it's out there. It's been on social media. You could see our interchanges.
Yeah. I'm not saying there's anything nefarious with it. That's not where I was going with it.
It was publicly. We publicly supported each other. And she came out, I think, in December, talked to on social media about Cuomo. So, but then didn't get into the press until she did her Medium article.
Do you believe that the media and so many Democrats would have jumped on Cuomo in this way were it not for the deaths? If you don't believe that, what do you think is the reason why Cuomo has been all of a sudden so susceptible to these charges of sexual harassment? Because it came, for your case, because it's a clear opposite of Biden. In your case, they entirely attacked you. You were the problem, not the fact that Biden most likely or potentially did it. No. You were the problem. The problem was that you brought it up. Trump is a clear and present danger. Trump is going to destroy America. And so Tara Reade has to be sacrificed on an altar of getting Joe Biden over the finish line. That's the way I saw it. But Cuomo, why all of a sudden were they willing to eat Cuomo alive when Cuomo was the guy who they were like, this guy's presidential, this guy's this guy's that? Why do you think so much traction was gained in regards to hitting him with the sexual assault stories?
That's an interesting discussion. And I think that I have a couple of thoughts on this. One is I think that there's a fight going on at a higher level in the elite Democrats behind some of the power brokers about Cuomo and about Biden. I think there's a power struggle playing out right now that we don't see or hear about. But it's there. And you might want to look at maybe Hillary Clinton's interest in 2024 and the governorship and that whole thing and who they want in that position, that kind of thing. So I think that there's some sort of struggle. The 15,000 deaths plus is horrible. And the fact that a staffer came forward and said, that they helped cover up the numbers and admitted what they did, that's criminal. It's awful. The sexual misconduct that he, continually, that sort of atmosphere, again, it has been covered up. It was like Biden, right? They say it was an open secret. People knew this about Cuomo. People know this about Biden, but it's an open secret, but they don't deal with it unless it can be used to weaponize to get the person to take a fall or go down. So I think you're right in that they probably weaponized. They decided, okay, let's let this flood happen. However, bear in mind too that Cuomo raised more money in his recent race than Joe Biden did in one of his for the presidential. He has a lot of support from certain people with a lot of money. So I think there's still a struggle. There was even talk that they were going to let the sexual harassment and sexual misconduct story die down and that he would still be governor and they would work through whatever happened with, the COVID the situation that he oversaw. And I really think that there's a push to have him leave. And they're, again, using the mantle of MeToo because you saw Nancy Pelosi all of a sudden announce there has to be a criminal investigation into Cuomo. She certainly didn't say that about my case, did she?
No, she didn't.
No. So, and then you saw Biden finally say something in an interview saying that there should be an investigation and even said there might be criminal ramifications. And the audacity of that was amazing. But it also kind of said to me as a citizen, oh, okay, they've decided he's going to be thrown under every bus. They're done with Cuomo. And he's fighting back, but I don't know if he'll survive it. I don't think he will.
To survive this. I want to get into your book for a moment. So what was the impetus in you writing this book? And what is the thing that you're trying to communicate with this book? Meaning, because usually when people write a book, they have like a purpose behind the book, not just trying to articulate this aspect of themselves. So they're also trying to do something in the larger physical matter reality world. What was your objectives and goal into writing this book?
Yeah, that's it. That's a good question. I felt very bad about the fact that my coming forward led to this pushback that was so strong that it had a chilling effect for other survivors to come forward. And it also, there's like a playbook of, and I wrote about it in an op-ed recently that was published on RT, but I talked about how, they silence, smear, attack, and then start again. There's like the cycle of what they do to whistleblower type people that come forward about whatever against powerful people. And I really saw that happening again with Lindsay Boylan. They started to, and then had to back off. Right. But when I was thinking about the book, it was partly survival in the sense of emotional survival, not physical, but like emotional. I was going through so much by writing everything down, by documenting it. I wanted to leave a message, I guess, for my daughter, her children, whenever they come into the world, and to other survivors, that even though I did have my life destroyed, I lost my housing, my work, I was almost, it was really stunning what happened, but I still don't regret coming forward because I didn't have to hold on to that information about Joe Biden anymore. I told about what happened and I stood up and I used my voice to stand in my truth. And that's so important because no matter what happens, we have to be able to stand in our truth. And, I did receive, like you, as you noted, a lot of pushback. So when I wrote the book, I wanted to create a space where people could feel like there are ways you can come forward. Like, yes, this was my experience, but at the end of it, I also gained a lot of support. Like Avalon Clare is a person who did designed the cover of my book. She and a group of survivors and other people that are just interested citizens got together and support me. And there's a group of them online and social media and other ways. They check on me. They make sure I'm okay. But I gathered a community around me of people that cared, that didn't want to see a powerful person use all their resources to silence someone. So I wrote about that support. Rose McGowan, of course, other people that, I got a phone call from Anita Hill, which was very meaningful.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that was very interesting early on. I've gotten, I've had really interesting conversations with like Chelsea Manning. Yeah. I've had, different people talking to me about different things, but the theme is the same: to just stand in your truth, and you're going to get, blasted, but just stay there and stay with it and see it through. I feel empowered in the sense that I used my voice to say what I needed to say. I also wanted to call out, some of the journalists, like the one from the Washington Post, which I talk about in the beginning of the book. She actually asked me the most inappropriate questions, which I won't say now, but you can read the book to find out what they were, but very inappropriate and was not trauma informed. So the other thing is that we need trauma informed journalists that know how to talk to sexual assault survivors so that it doesn't come out in bits and pieces and drips and drabs, and can come out in a more coherent way, and that's safer for the trauma survivor to kind of move through. Actors of the media, or like, for instance, the Washington Post, who's it owned by? It's owned by, I believe, Bezos, right?
Totally. Well, one thing, how much, you said you lost your house, your career. What did you lose in coming out with the story, and how did you lose it? Was it just the loss of the career that tumbled down into the other items the moment that you came out? Because what were you working in the capacity? You were a Senate staffer at what point? What were you when you came out to tell this?
Well, when I first came forward going through protocol back in '93, I lost my career immediately when I filed the sexual harassment report. After the assault, and I had filed the sexual harassment. I was unable to get a job on the Hill because I was forced out of Biden's office, of course,
right,
and forced to resign. And then I ended up working for a state senator, and I still tried to hold on to my democratic ideals. I was an Obama supporter back in the day. Biden happened to be on the ticket, but I did vote for Obama, and I was not involved at that point in politics, but I was raising my daughter, and, we had survived I had a difficult divorce and, survived domestic violence, and was trying to keep her safe. I had no intention of coming forward at that time about Joe Biden, and there was really no mechanism to do that. And then in 2019, you know, as you know the rest of the story, so about coming forward. But yeah, what that happened when I was doing work at that time, I lost all my independent contracts. I was working on independent contracting and doing some other work, and you would Google my name and see these horrible things, horrible articles. And so it became difficult. I was renting a little house, and the owners of the property had heard on CNN that I had had death threats. They literally heard it on the news and came that next morning and said, you know, you need to leave the property because you have death threats, and we're voting for Joe Biden, and we've heard these things, and we heard about your bankruptcy online. You didn't tell us you had a bankruptcy, because I didn't. And it had been years before, like 8 years before or whatever. But all of my private information was just available online, because the New York Times, one of the things that happened, which I skipped over that was really difficult, was they, in the first article, they accidentally published my social security number.
No, they didn't. Are you serious? How is that a mistake? Like, do you think that was a mistake, or do you think that was punitive and intentional? I mean, that's a big deal. And I've never seen them do that, where they publish somebody's social security number.
I don't know. They published my congressional ID that had the number on there, and they didn't, you know, because I had to prove who I was or prove that I worked and all that. Anyway, they blamed it on the photo editor not doing it, but they had it online because it was we were on Pacific time, you know, where I was living in California. And so I didn't find out until the next morning. My friend called me, and she was in a panic, and she said, she was on the East Coast. She goes, your social security number's online. Like, this is the front page of the New York Times. You have this article. And I was like groggy. And then she called the New York Times, and I called, and then it took a couple of hours. They finally got it down, but then it was
too late. It was already up.
It was already out, and I was getting messages with it. So that caused problems for me. It also allowed people to just dig through everything in my life if they're using that, set up false accounts. All kinds of things happened when that happened. So it really affected my life in seen and unseen ways. I had difficulties. I adopted a horse. I had difficulties finding a place to board him. I had to, as you know, leave my housing. Then, of course, I was being threatened with a criminal investigation. So it was kind of tough to get a job right then. With that pending, yeah, it was a mess. It was pretty much a mess. I'm kind of laughing because it's like, I don't even know if I got through. And I wrote a book on that, but I did it. And yeah, that was an amazing time.
Just for the last question before we close out, if you had something to get across to people now, meaning when they're reading the book and it's something that you wanted to communicate to them, what would it be? So just a snapshot. The first one, have you grown from this experience, and if so, how? And what would you want to communicate at the very end all be all of this book? What do you want to communicate to other women who are in the exact same situation that you're in, or that you were in 93?
I have grown from it in the sense that I think I've gained some more emotional intelligence about dealing, and just some knowledge about dealing with the world and how it works at this level. I kind of laughed earlier because it's just so absurd, some of the things I had to go through, just trying to tell a story about what happened in 1993 and how I got just taken down the side track. What I would say to other women is that, you know, I have a strong sense of humor, and that came through in the book, and I have a strong sense of joy and trust. Maybe some people say I've been naive sometimes, but I don't want to lose who I am fundamentally by cynicism or by bad experiences. I'd rather, like what you said, learn and grow and expand my consciousness, expand my knowledge. And really what I want to say to other women is or other people coming forward about this difficult topic, is don't let them change you. You know, this happened to you, but it's not all of you. It's just a thing that happened. You can move forward, and you can live a full and interesting life beyond it. And if you want to help others in that regard, do it. Or if you want to heal your life and just move on, that's good too. For me, it has sort of cemented what I want to do, which is to write and to heal and to help others through their journey, and to call attention to our media and how they're treating people. I want our country to be better than what it is right now. I don't like the direction it's taken, and I want to be part of moving it in a different direction that's more positive. As far as me personally, work in progress, healing, and is a journey for all of us. We've all had trauma in our lives of different types. And then it's integrating it and then using it for something positive and that can help, right? Because if, my philosophy that I've read, I think Gandhi said it, if you can't help, then don't harm. And that's what I'd like to do.
The voice that you guys were listening to in this excellent interview is Tara Reade. She's an author, former Senate aide, survivor, animal rights activist, actress, and a poet. Her new book, Left Out When the Truth Doesn't Fit In, covers the aftermath of re-victimization of speaking out about the sexual assault with the senator, now President Joe Biden in 1993. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, we're back with our last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering American and global news, events, politics, and more across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 907 new coronavirus deaths and 62,004 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. That is uber specific. Over the past week, there's been an average of 64,847 cases per day, an increase of 19% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 30,870,900 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 556,000 have died from it. And this is per the New York Times. President Biden has moved the goal for all adults to be eligible for the coronavirus vaccine to April 19th and has urged the American citizens to not be complacent, warning that new variants of the virus are spreading and they're moving quickly, especially the one in Brazil. Researchers from Oxford University in Britain say that after examining over 250,000 cases in the United States, those who've contracted and suffered COVID-19 have a higher rate of brain illness than those who haven't. If coronavirus wasn't disconcerting enough, apparently, brain health.
And this is, I just want to comment on this one real quick. This has been talked about for a while. This is as far as I can tell, the largest study done on this to date. But if you remember from early on last year, people who contracted COVID had described weird symptoms, whether it's fatigue not restricted to their body. Yeah, exactly. It was called long COVID at the time. Whether you're talking about, again, fatigue, where you can say, okay, if your respiratory system gets hit, that would induce some fatigue. But people were experiencing weird mental fatigue that they couldn't explain just with respiratory symptoms. And then people were also reporting a loss of smell, some higher incidence of mental illness, those kinds of things. So this is not surprising, but it is deeply worrying. I don't know about you, Jamarl, but I'd rather use some of the use of my lungs than some of the use of my brain.
Right. Well,
I'm sure a lot of folks are in the same boat.
Well, it's very strange. I mean, because one of the things that we were encountering, we think of it like a cold almost, but that's not the way it was presenting. I mean, it was presenting with inflammation symptoms, basically. If there was somewhere where inflammation was going to be an issue or problem, COVID seemed to make it worse. And so you would have some people, like you said, sense of smell. You would have people having these kind of weird anomalies of anomalous symptoms that didn't seem to, or you wouldn't think necessarily apply. But again, inflammation seemed to be one of the key components of it. But yeah, very weird. Very, very weird. Kevin McCarthy has demanded, I say, a classified briefing after 2 Yemenis on a terror watch list were stopped at the southern border in 2 separate incidents in January and March. Republicans are using the 2 incidents as examples of the consequences of Joe Biden's perceived decision to soften Trump's hardline immigration and deportation policies. Jen Psaki said that the incidents underscores the work they do to keep criminals from coming into the country. Meanwhile, DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has reportedly told CBP staff that they may soon resume plugging gaps in the border wall, completing some unfinished sections, a project President Biden criticized while running for office. Oh, ain't that nice? Ain't that nice? Oh, I hate that wall. Oh, Trump is horrible for that wall. Now, you go and silently finish that wall. That's astonishing. I love that. I love that. I wonder, are they going to complain about it in the way that they were complaining about it with Trump? Not in the least. They're not going to breathe a word about building that wall.
No, they won't. But I'm sure Republicans will hit Biden on it. Like, okay, you were constantly criticizing Donald Trump about this. Democrats in general were, and now you're going to do the same thing. Now you're going to follow suit. Now you're going to just imitate him. You know what I'm saying? And it's a valid attack.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. God, man, honesty, or not even honesty. I don't even know if you call it integrity. It's just the ease at which they slip into hypocrisy is astonishing. And I think what this means is that reality is far more complicated than what we would want to own up to it being. So taking an honest approach to it, where you make the case of saying, look, this is the best we can think of, basically. And it's the best that we can think of maintaining the exact same policies that we're maintaining now. Meaning the issue is not so much the border per se. The issue is the border while keeping everything the same in the way that we want to pursue our affairs. Now, well, you can change the way you pursue your affairs to come up with a different result at the border, but that's not kind of part of the mix. And so it's just, they can't admit that though. And so it has to come out where they just say, Trump is horrible, Trump sucks, Trump is doing all of this stuff at the border. And then when you get in, you do the same thing. Like, it's just very weird, the way the politics goes. You can't just call a rock a rock. It has to be a diamond. No, it's a rock. Texas and Louisiana are arguing in a lawsuit against federal government that Biden administration is allowing convicted immigrants to be released and not held for deportation. Texas officials said they were acting on their own to delay the release of those immigrants. The Biden administration has focused on threats to health and national security when it comes to the potential damages from immigrants or the dangers from immigrants, whereas Trump unabashedly focused on criminal threats from immigrants. So far, neither the Justice Department nor ICE have responded to the lawsuit. Teams from Iran, the United States, and other members of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal, met in hotels in Vienna, Austria to agree to talks on the U.S. and Iran returning to the deal. Now, this is the deal that President Donald Trump pulled out of in May 2018. They've agreed to the creation of 2 working groups, one designed to bring the United States back into the deal by dropping sanctions on Iran, and the other one to bring Iran back into compliance with the deal by basically bringing down the enrichment of uranium. Between the 2 of those things, the first or the latter is the easiest one. The first one, and believe it or not, the problem here is not Iran. Iran stayed with the deal a year after the U.S. pulled out of the deal. The problem here is that the U.S. is out of compliance with this deal. Let's be very clear. The mainstream media is not going to talk about it that way because they can't talk about the U.S. being out of compliance with the deal. It doesn't factor into their consciousness. It doesn't occur to them that the U.S. will be breaking the rules of a deal, an agreement that it said it was going to be a part of. So instead, They talk to people who are in Iran. They talk to people who are representing Iran on television. And they would ask them questions like, hey, what deal is Iran willing to accept to come back to the agreement? And they would make the point of saying the United States needs to get rid of all of its sanctions. You can't really expect the United States to do that, do you? To which the answer is yes. If they want us back in the agreement, they will get rid of their sanctions because the U.S. is out of compliance with the deal. And they were out of compliance with the deal first. We acted in response. If they want us to come back to the table, to get back to the deal, then they would need to come back into compliance with the agreement that they stopped being in compliance of. That argument to me is the most logical thing in the world, and yet from the standpoint of the way we talk about it here and the way mainstream media is going to talk about it, they're going to act as if the issue is Iran and Iran's compliance to the deal. Don't believe the hype.
No, we leave out the part, but like you say, that part was actually reported. The fact that we pulled out of it earlier, that they pulled out of it later, I've seen that reported decently well enough. What's muddied the waters here is, okay, think back to what Trump did when he pulled out of the deal. His reason for doing it, other than sort of implicitly it being Obama's deal and him not wanting to continue Obama's policies all over the place, his stated reason for doing it was that the terms of the deal were too soft on Iran.
Right.
That it was not hard enough, that it wasn't a good deal, was how he continuously put it. Biden didn't think so when he was vice president under Obama. I'm sure. I've never heard him say that. If he did, he would be criticizing his own administration effectively when he was VP. So what's his justification? I don't really hear one. The bit about Iran supporting terrorists.
You mean for remaining outside of the deal from Biden?
For remaining outside of the deal. If it was a good deal, you should get back into it. And the way that you do that, again, is very simply you drop the sanctions on your end, and Iran has said that they would come back to it if they saw that happening from us.
Yeah, right.
But again, he hasn't actually, as far as I can tell, given a good justification on why we're still not in it, why he hasn't moved, why as one of his first moves as an incoming president wasn't to attempt to salvage the Obama JCPOA deal, which again, he was the vice president for. He was a big player, the second biggest player in the administration while that happened. It's weird that he's carrying out in his own way Trump's policies a lot more than he's carrying out Obama's. I want to make that clear, and I feel like the media should be hitting him on it, but they aren't.
Well, I mean, the media, this kind of gets to my point, though. I mean, the media may bring up, okay, the U.S. pulled out of the deal. By the same token, they deprioritize that. Like, that's not, meaning the focus and the framing of the question is not, when is the U.S. going to come back into compliance with the deal? That's not the focus and the framing. The focus and the framing is always around this notion that Iran is out of compliance or Iran is doing something wrong. That's the point that I'm trying to make, not so much that they're lying about the first pullout. But no, on some level, you're right. Like, they haven't pushed Biden on that. But again, this gets back to the thing, they're not going to push him on it. Because in their mind, it's not the U.S. that's out of compliance. That's the issue here. Like, that's why they're not going to hit Biden on that issue, if that makes sense. It doesn't factor into their consciousness. I don't think they think of it in those terms. I really do think they think of it in terms of Iran is out of compliance with the deal, and Iran is the one that needs to make some kind of amends or agreement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Also, if you remember, Biden was being pretty boisterous about this deal during the time he was out of office, meaning when he was running running against Trump, he was being pretty hawkish on Iran and on Venezuela, both of those. And like you said, it's very bizarre since he was in the administration that basically had the JCPOA. You would have thought that he would have tried to go back to it almost immediately. But I really do think that the issue is saving face. That if he tried to go back to the deal in the way that you wanted him to, the Republicans would hit him, and you may even have some members of his own party hit him, calling him weak, saying he's capitulating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I don't know. We'll see. I suspect that the working groups that these guys are talking about, it's very easy if you think of it in terms of, well, if the U.S. come back into compliance, Iran said it'll come back into compliance. But the issue is order of operations. Who's going to come back into compliance first? Because the one that comes back into it first is the one that the other side is going to say lost some level of face. And they're trying to figure out this weird way. Say that again?
All that America wants and all that Joe Biden wants here is a U.S.-backed regime in Iran. We want control of the levers of power in that country. It's very simple. That is our goal there, effectively. Now, we can't do that.
Right.
They had that happen, and then they overthrew it, and they've learned from that, and they're not going to let it happen again. But that is what we want. Be simple, and that's what this is all pushing for. Of course, that's the whole point of it. That's the understated premise that we don't like to bring up in the Western press, that we bring up on this show pretty constantly. And it's good to keep in mind that underneath all of this back and forth, that's what Obama would have wanted. That's what any president, hearing what they hear and thinking the kinds of thoughts they think, would want from Iran under the current status quo.
Well, if you think about it, do you remember that speech? I forget by the name of the general, was it Clark, I believe, where he was making this point of saying that the goal was to knock down 7 other countries, finally ending up at Iran, with the idea of basically reshaping the Middle East. And when you think about it, that is exactly what basically took place. I mean, regardless of the president, the pattern was still the same. Gobble this country up, and you gobble up the countries up to the point of the country that you want to get to. So if I need to get to Iran, then I need to gobble up Syria and Libya, etc., in order to kind of make my way around to it. And when you look at the foreign policy, if it wasn't for Russia and Iran intervening in order to help Syria, that country would have fell also. Yeah, I mean, it seems like that he was correct in his assessment of that. Let's do this. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. If you guys are in Kansas City, we're on the radio at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, make sure you give us the like and share that audio or video. Also, make sure you subscribe if that's permitted. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So Georgia has put out a new election law. Now, many of the countries, or many of the states, have been putting out new election laws ever since Joe Biden has basically won that election. Right here, this is based on the Washington Post. There have been more than 250 laws that are under consideration in state legislatures aimed at reducing or introducing new voting restrictions. And this is despite the fact that, according to the Heritage Foundation, there's only been one case of voter fraud. So to have a conversation about this law in Georgia, and we're probably going to expand this even to Hunter Biden and whether or not the media can cover Hunter Biden honestly, we are joined by Peter, the tech guy, and Jimmy. He is author of Hail Mary, the Perfect Protestant and Catholic Prayer, and host of your Prayer your prayer intentions, airing on WQPH 89.3 in Shirley-Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Saturday, noon, Eastern Standard. Peter, how's it going today? You doing all right?
I'm doing all right. We still waiting to get some tests on the wife. Hopefully those will come out right. But since you mentioned the show, I do want to point out that this Sunday is Divine Mercy Sunday. So if there's ever a day to go to church and go to confession, this is the weekend to do it. Divine Mercy Sunday, the Sunday after Easter. I urge all Catholics and non-Catholics to consider going to Mass and going to church for confession, because this is the weekend to do it.
Now, what is that? For people who, because I don't know what it is, I'm not Catholic, but what is the significance of that particular day after Easter to go to
Divine
church?
Mercy Sunday comes from the Saint Faustina, a very famous book, The Diary of Saint Faustina. She was a Catholic nun in the 1930s who was canonized in the early 2000s after having her stuff first rejected by the church, then accepted. She had visions of Christ, and you might have seen in places the image of Jesus. Jesus, I trust in you. The command was, I want this image created, I want to venerate it, and I want people to know about the mercy of Christ, and I want there to be a feast the week after Easter of divine mercy, to let people know that God is merciful, and regardless of your sins, you approach God, He will forgive you. Approach contritely, God will forgive, or as Christ puts it Himself, before as I come as the just judge, I come as the merciful Father. So in other words, take the mercies there if you want it, type of thing. And Divine Mercy Sunday comes every year, the week after Easter. You'll see events all over the country. In fact, the National Shrine is in Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts, Stockbridge, Mass, if I'm not mistaken.
Before we get into the voting thing,
it's not going to be very big this year and last year because of COVID.
Right.
But in your local church, there's probably going to be events.
Is God's forgiveness infinite? Meaning, if somebody goes, it doesn't matter what the person did. Like, let's say, for example,
God's forgiveness is infinite. In fact, a very great saint, and I forget the man's name, mentioned that if Judas had, instead of hanging himself, gone back to the apostles in penitence, we would have churches all over the world of St. Judas the Penitent. Because remember that both Judas and Peter betrayed Christ. Peter denied Him 3 times and then ran off, feeling guilty. Judas betrayed Him, then returned the money feeling guilty. But Judas could not forgive himself, or could not bring himself to come back to accept that forgiveness. Now, under Catholic doctrine, and other sects may not say this, we do not know any specific person in hell, because a person can repent in their last moments. So we have canonized saints. We declare these people are definitely in heaven, but we do not have a list of people who are definitely in hell. There's lots of doctrine saying that there are many more people in hell than heaven, but because people can repent and ask forgiveness up to the last moment of their life. In fact, one of the doctrines that St. Faustina promulgated was that Christ will approach a person at the moment of death. I'll keep trying till your very last moment. I'll reach out my hand. You can choose to draw it away, but I will reach out my hand. And there's a very famous sermon from St. Leonard of Port Maurice from 250 years ago, which repeats the line, "Thy damnation comes from thee," because God will continue to give you a shot, continue to say, "Come on, come back to me."
Wait, even when people are in hell, He still gives this?
No, not when they're in hell. Once they're in hell,
it's too late.
They've made their final decision. But as long as they are conscious and alive, to your last living moment, you have the capacity to repent. Now, the problem with that is that a lot of people take this the wrong way. It's like the law. You should not wait till that point. It's like the lottery. Someone will win the lottery, but just because someone will win the lottery, it's a bad idea to base all of your financial planning on winning the lottery.
It's like in my last 2 seconds.
God will offer his hand up to the final moment of your conscious moment of your life, but it's a much better idea to take that hand beforehand.
Do you think
that's the fallacy that gets made on occasion, which can be dangerous? But it's that Christianity is a religion of contradictions in that God is powerful, God is merciful, God delivers justice, God delivers mercy. That there's many things. It's amphibian in many ways.
Do you think? Well, let me ask you this: do you ever think that there's a contradiction built into the notion that God is creating human beings, God is creating the soul of the individual per se, and even though he's omnipotent, he also is putting people in damnation, meaning the moment that he created the person, he knows the person is going to burn in hell. Where's choice built into that process?
There's two fallacies you're missing there.
Go for it.
First of all, God does not Christ existed in time, but God does not exist in time. So his perception is like looking at a painting. If you have a diorama of a painting, you're seeing all of the painting at once. God perceives all of these. There's a difference between seeing something and making something happen. God perceives all of these things, but he does not make it. You have an individual choice. You have the ability to make the freedom, and that's the difference, to make a free choice. If you are predestined, and some Calvinists, some Christian sects believe in complete predestination. John Calvin talked about that. That takes away your individual choice. That takes away freedom. God freely allows you. You can sin. You cannot sin. You can take this right move. You can take this wrong move. It's like I'm a father of two sons, and any parent knows that it's not your will that your son does something stupid or something wrong, but you give them that choice especially once they're of age. They have the choice, and you have to give them that choice because if you force somebody to virtue, then it's not virtue.
It's true, but as a parent, you can also go through, okay, what did I do wrong here? What did what did I do right? You can.
I guess be very difficult. Believe me, I go through that. All of us.
Yes,
yeah. I mean, a parent can do the best he can, and God is the same way. God will do the best he can with you, and sometimes he'll help you out and give you easy victories, as C.S. Lewis used to say. But because he does not ravage, he only woos. Sooner or later, he takes away the hand, and you have to take responsibility. A person has to decide.
I guess my thought is, if God is omnipotent and he sees, even if he doesn't interact, he just sees.
I think God actually, my own opinion is God interacts more than people realize. But
okay, so that's where my problem comes in. It's God creates, God interacts, God sees, and God would have to know that people are going to hell the moment that he creates them. Meaning, even if you make the argument of free will and free choice, that's still knowledge of that individual and the outcome that individual is going to have. It seems unfair. It seems greatly unfair that God will know that person is going to spend an eternity in hell when that person is created.
Why would it be unfair if a person makes a willing choice? It's if I make the choice to, like, I'm overweight, and I've made choices based on I do not eat as healthy as I should.
Right. Me either.
If I have health problems because I have eaten more than I should, then it's my responsibility. If I choose to make a bad investment, if I decided to buy GameStop when it was 500 like and it's now 30 or 40 or something like that, and I chose to do it, I have no business complaining if I'm down to 50. If I'm down to 50, or as I would put it, since you broadcast out of D.C., if D.C. chooses not to enforce drug laws, not to enforce prostitution laws, to allow and not or cities do no cash bail, and then the city has problems with crime. The city has problems with drugs because of these. If I choose to make these mistakes, I've got no business complaining about it. Now, someone can say, don't do this. This is a bad idea. This will hurt you.
Yeah, but see, I would argue you're not making a choice.
I would make the argument with Major League Baseball in Georgia, to get to the topic you actually want to talk to me about. Major League Baseball made the same mistake that the Romans and the Jews made on Good Friday. They presumed that because on Good Friday, the Jewish leadership, and I should say the leadership because Jesus was a Jew, his followers were Jews, the people who he fed were Jews, the people who followed him, who listened to his sermon were Jews, the people who rejected him were Jews, because he was a Jew living in a Jewish land. But the Jewish authorities and the Romans presumed that because Jesus was, tried and convicted, put into a tomb sealed, that he was finished. And if you were a person that the authorities confronted on Good Friday and said, do you follow Jesus? Yeah, you might say, well, Jesus, no big deal. He was just some guy who's talked a lot. But then 3 days later, things change. And, of course, eventually Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire, because they did not see beyond Good Friday. They didn't see the Easter Sunday that was coming. Major League Baseball and all of these people playing woke games with the Georgia law are presuming that the left will always be in power. And that's a bad presumption, because when you decide to get into politics, when you decide to take sides, that's it. Like, I'm a baseball fan. I've loved baseball since I was 5. Peter, I didn't watch any of a game last year because they were woke.
Peter, let me say this.
This year, I shut off the TV.
Let me say this. I would argue that a choice is not being made, and that ultimately God is still responsible. Now, what I mean by that is, if I'm a software engineer and I build a program, and in the context of that program, I build a world, I build the experiences that the person is going to encounter, I build the person's psychological matrix, all of those things. And then I plop that person in. And I know as a flat fact, because I am the person that built that world, that person is going to bust hell wide open. And that little bit of code that has the bit of awareness is going to spend eternity burning in hell. And I knew that the moment that I created them, especially since all of the circumstances that the thing encountered, I also engineered. If I know the psychology of the thing that I've just created, and I'm creating something that has certain weaknesses and everything else in the way that it was describe itself, how is that thing, even if it believes itself to be responsible for its outcome?
How is it not responsible? I mean, you're conflating seeing something with doing something.
No. I postulated that God is doing all of that. I postulated that he created the world. He created the psychological matrix. He created the way that the person perceives in an environment to which the person was in. That goes beyond just seeing. That goes into doing.
Well, and even with the example, we got to go to a break pretty soon here, but even with the example of a city, for instance, instituting, no drug enforcement policies, no enforcement on sex workers, prostitution, all that stuff, all the example that you used there, it seemed like you were leveling some moral weight on the city for doing so. It's not just the people in the city who live in it, who are living in a city without enforcement of those crimes. You might see higher crime rates or more of certain things happening. But the city is also making its own decisions. And in the same way, it seems that God has set up all of these, assuming there is one, God has set up all of these incentives, all of these forces that we're operating within. And assuming that he created us, he created each of us individually. I guess going back to the parent thing, do you ever think God regrets having created some of us? That's a serious question, but can also be laughed at. I don't know. What's your take, Pete? Maybe you might be thinking he's regretting creating me at this point. What do you think, though?
No, God may regret the decisions we make, and God will give helps. God will give helps. People do not perceive, in my opinion, and again, this is my opinion, and I know that Father Leonard of Port Maurice, who I've mentioned, talks about this as well. God will give people hints, will give people helps, and will give the most obscure people the help. And in fact, one of the things that God will give us is that, and this has fallen into disfavor in terms of philosophically, in the modern era, in the last 20 years or so. But this used to be standard stuff. The natural law, philosophy has taught us for thousands of years that the natural law is written in our hearts. That people have an idea of what is right, what is wrong, what is perceived. That perception, which comes from God, and that's why it's called the natural law, because it is natural to humanity. And again, you're in the example I gave. Let's not forget the voter, because especially, and if you lived in an oligarchy, if you lived in a monarchy, it's one thing, but in America, we're allowed to vote now. How those votes are counted, as Stalin would remind us, it's who counts the votes that matters. But in a republic, in a city, if your voters choose to make a decision, they're going to live with those consequences of that decision. If you make a good decision, good things will happen. Bad decision, bad things will happen, and sometimes you'll have curveballs because you can't anticipate everything. But as a general rule, we get the governments we deserve on the city level, on the state level, on the national level. I just wish that we deserved better more often.
All right, you know what? We're going to close it here. We've gone over. Pete, we're going to stick with you through the other side. We were not planning on talking about this, but this has proved to be a fascinating conversation. Maybe we'll come back to elements of it. Regardless, we got to close this one out. We are joined by Pete Njemi. He's the author of Hail Mary, the Perfect Protestant and Catholic Prayer, and he's the host of Your Prayer Intentions, airing on WQPH 89.3 in Shirley-Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Saturdays at noon Eastern. By the way, you can follow Pete on Twitter at TheTechGuyBlog and on his website, thetechguyblog.com. And we were planning on talking Georgia's voting law, getting into some Hunter Biden. We ended up talking theodicy and whether, God is vindicated and doing it. It's not usually it's not our focus, but hey, it's a good conversation. Again, we'll be back with Pete on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Alrighty, let's get back into this. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we continue to be joined, by the way, by Pete Njemi. Peter the Tech Guy Njemi is the author of Hail Mary, the Perfect Protestant and Catholic Prayer, and the host of Your Prayer Intentions, airing on WQPH 89.3 in Shirley-Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Saturdays at noon Eastern. Pete, thank you for being with us. We've been talking about the new Georgia voting law on this show for a while now, and I think so far we've had, I believe, 2 conversations about it. One with Greg Palast, another with Ted Rall. I might be missing some there, but those are the 2 main ones. They're both on the left. One of them, I would just say, just broadly speaking, they both lean quite a bit more to the left. They were both broadly opposed to this law. What I wanted to do, and what I believe Jamarl wanted to do too, is, hear another side on this, get into a conversation with somebody who might support it or might see some different stuff, because frankly, I don't know. I know that this is one of those issues that it's intensely politicized. And the left frequently argues that there are racist policies built into how we restrict people from voting. And a bit broadly, there are Republican ploys to restrict voting, to lower the numbers of people who can vote. And that if they weren't to do that, you'd see much larger Democratic majorities in a lot of these states. And then the Republicans say that voter fraud is rampant. It is all over the place. And we don't know about it. It's like this hidden element of this iceberg in our political system, and that the Democrats are supporting voter fraud in order to get a wider margin on their votes. So each side is effectively making, in a weird way, similar claims about the other. They're saying that the other side, is just pushing for more votes. In some sense, that there isn't a there. It's what it comes down to. I might be misportraying that. I'm sure many members of the audience are pissed at me for getting that wrong in their opinion. But I wanted to hear from you, Pete. How do you see this new law, and what do you think of this general dynamic in the states?
Well, I want to make 3 points about what you were saying concerning the vote, the ID law, and the motives. And I want to make a general. Before I make those 3 points, let me generally say that I always presume that any politician or any party is working towards its own victory. So let's I'm going to give that.
Agreed, frankly.
That I'm going to give that as a rote that parties and people act in their own ideas. Now, I am going to be 58 next month. And for most of my life, until about 1985, all of my life, the Democrats had controlled the House and the Senate. They didn't even lose the Senate until 1908, until Reagan's election, and they didn't lose the House until 95. From 1963, the year I was born, the Democrats had control. And during all that time, mind you, there was no early voting didn't exist. Drop boxes didn't exist. Absentee ballots were only something to be rare. So the idea that, Democrats can't win unless we have all these things is ridiculous. The second thing is, in the last election, there are many people, myself included, who believe this election was stolen. So naturally, in my opinion, if you are the left, if you are a person who insists that is ridiculous, that is simply a conspiracy theory. Anything that says, that proves, that makes the vote more secure, that says, of course, we're checking to make sure that these are real votes. That if you believe that the last election was honest, you should welcome anything that makes the vote more transparent and less vulnerable to fraud. And the third point I would make is the question that I asked on my own site, which is, can anybody tell me what prevents a person who voted legally in the last election in Georgia, or I should say the last two elections, because there was the Senate runoff, from legally voting in this election? Now, I'm not saying that it may be less convenient. If that box is an extra 100 yards away, or if you have 20 days to vote and now only have 14, that's less convenient, but it doesn't prevent the person from voting. Nobody can point out a person unable to vote because of this new law. And what's really hilarious is that a Georgia representative has basically called out President Biden on this, suggesting that he's introducing a new bill called the President Joe Biden Jim Crow on Steroids Avoider Act. And the new bill is going to change Georgia's voting laws so that they mirror the laws of Delaware, which is the president's home state, which does not have early voting in Delaware, does not have the drop boxes where you cannot have submitted absentee ballot without an excuse, as the Georgia law does. So I think this fuss is a lot of fuss about nothing. And when you make things less transparent, when you make the chain of custody of ballots less transparent, there's a reason. When you make as I said in military circles, if you make a diversion, you do it for a reason. When you make ballots less transparent, or you want to keep the custody of ballots less transparent, that's a reason. It's like the guy in Guys and Dolls who rolls the dice. The dice are all blank, but he remembers exactly where the dots are.
Peter, I do understand where you're coming from with that. Look, I think the problem is it's not an issue about transparency. The issue here is that the laws that they are putting into place are doing so under something that they can't demonstrate. Meaning, it's one thing if you tell me that, look, there's rampant voter fraud. Because this is stuff that was being said even during Obama's time, where they were like, there's rampant voter fraud. And back during that time, I think it was 2012, there was a study, and they found out of 600 million votes cast, there were only 10 cases of in-person voter fraud. And even now, I think there was like one case of in-person voter fraud based on the Heritage Foundation thing. So I guess my thing is, it's one thing if you want to make changes. Okay, fair enough, but shouldn't you have a justification for those changes? And you feeling like something was nefarious and wrong with it, that can't be the standard, especially if that standard is going to make it difficult for certain people to vote in a way that's going to shave off some percentage points. And I'm telling you, that's the exact reason why it's being done. I mean, the not giving food thing kind of gives it away on some level. Let me ask you this. What do you have to demonstrate that this is necessary? Because this is not the only state that's doing that.
I'm sorry. That the whole argument. I don't think you have straw men this big in fields of wheat.
I'm not strawmanning you. Wait. What am I strawmanning you on?
Yeah, first, the idea that there was only one case of voter fraud in the last thing is ridiculous. Secondly,
how many cases of voter fraud were there?
Another indictment in Texas. I think it was last week, of another Democrat official involved in voter fraud.
Okay, how many cases of voter fraud were there?
We have a good chunk of the country who believes that the last election was stolen. And it's not just a question of one or two people. We have millions. And
yeah, because Donald Trump screamed into the largest megaphone that the election was stolen. That's why. It's not that they just kind of oriented themselves around that position. It was stoked.
It's like the media. The reason the media is falling apart is because people don't believe it anymore. The reason why the CDC's recommendations are not going anywhere is people don't believe them anymore. Once you lose the credibility of elections in a republic, that's it. And that is more than enough reason to do it. Now, if people live in the bubble and do not want to believe this, that's fine.
So wait, just so I'm clear, and we're talking about straw men. You're basically said that people who aren't believing you are basically in a bubble. And I've resisted the urge of making that claim or claiming that you're being disingenuous in the argument and everything else. But if you want to have ad hominem attacks against me, that's okay, Peter. I can take it.
I'm saying you were building a straw man. There's a difference between building a straw man. I think you're a nice guy. You're kind enough to share your airwaves with me.
I guess my point is I'm not building a straw man.
I think you're a great guy.
I guess my point is I'm not building a straw man against you. I made a very straightforward case in saying that the justification for this is just not there. And you have to show that the number of people that voter fraud is so rampant. Not just you feel that way, or not just a large number of people feel that way. Because the fact is, I can understand why a large number of people feel that way, since the president of the United States told 40, 50 million people that, he lost, that he won this election in spades, that it wasn't even close, that there's fraud all over the place, and people are cheating him, and Hugo Chavez, et cetera, et cetera. That's why they believe it. That's the point I'm trying to make to you.
Night to suddenly stop their counting. Is that normal? Is it just basic common sense?
Well, but this is also I hear you, and we back in the day we were having some of those conversations. Although we both came on there was not enough voter fraud to swing it in favor of Biden. That was where we landed on that one. But regardless, it seems like you said, Pete, this has been much ado about nothing, or it's been blown up. The whole looking into it more. Some of the provisions that are getting a lot of pushback are being misportrayed by the press across the board, and by Democrats. If people already need one of the big things that gets put on this is that now instead of signing your name on an absentee ballot, you need to put in your ID. You need to put in some details from your ID, and apparently you can use other details too. But basically, you now need to put information from your ID. But everybody's supposed to have a voter ID anyway. You're supposed to have some form of identification, a state ID that you can use to represent yourself. I am admittedly a novice on these issues, but asking people to put that information on a ballot instead of merely signing their name doesn't seem like that high of a hurdle. And it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that is racially targeted. Hey, but what am I missing? I guess this would be more targeted at you, Jamarl. What am I missing there? Why is this such a big deal?
You mean that one provision? Well, I don't think it's the issue of that one provision. I think it's the combination of all of these things. I mean, new voter ID requirements, a limit on the number of ballot drop boxes, like that. Why limit the number of ballot drop boxes? You tell me. I mean, what's the harm in expanding the vote tally and making it easier for people to vote as opposed to making it more difficult to vote? I mean, even giving the Republicans control of the voting apparatus is troublesome. Say it again, Shane? Shortening the the runoff elections? Like, I guess I'm making the point, these things are lessening the number of people to vote. And why would you ever want to lessen the number of people to vote?
Well, and here's the explanation that would cover both reducing the number of drop boxes and shortening the window, because it would make it easier to tabulate the votes, because you have fewer pickup points and you have a shorter duration during which you need to get the work done. It basically, you can consolidate it. You can
No. I mean, I'm saying what? It doesn't matter. Like, that's irrelevant in the context of expanding the number of people to vote. Meaning, the goal of voting is not to make it easier for them to tabulate. The goal of voting is to make it easier for people in the country to choose who they want. And the goal of that should be easier voting. I'm saying they can make an excuse for it. I don't doubt that they're going to come up with some kind of fig leaf. I'm talking about the reality of things is that voting should be easy and it should be as ubiquitous as possible. And these guys are making rules and laws that make it more difficult. That's not me reciting.
They're talking. That's something that I just thought up on my end. And admittedly, I'm a novice, and so that could be a wrong argument to make. But like, that's not me reciting somebody else's talking point. It's just like that makes sense to me. And it seems like free and fair and efficient elections should incorporate both more voters and more efficient tabulation of their votes. Both of those things should be goals. And so if in some cases it's a competition, then it becomes a conversation over, okay, how is this going to land? How do we actually institute these policies so that simultaneously the most people are represented as you possibly can, and at the same time you represent their votes quickly so people know what's happening in their elections, votes don't get double counted or lost, those kinds of things, and everybody's vote gets efficiently processed. Those seem like sort of competing draws that you want more of. It's just a trade-off at some points in terms of how you do it.
Yeah, maybe. I don't see it as a trade-off. It doesn't have to be a trade-off. And in this case, they're forcing it to be a trade-off. I mean, look, like I said, you can have, voting should be ubiquitous. If, when Virginia did the thing where they were passing the voter ID laws, and they said, fine, we'll make sure everybody gets an ID. Fine, no issue. No issue with that. But you got to make sure that everybody gets the ID. That's the catch. And many of these things, it's not done in a way to ensure that we're expanding the voter population. It's done to shrink it. And I am saying that unless you can come up with a legitimate reason where there is ubiquitous voter fraud, and look, I'm reading directly from the Washington Post talking about it. It says there have been 250 laws that are under consideration in state legislatures this year aimed at introducing new voter restrictions, despite there having been only one actual criminal conviction for voter fraud in the last year's election. You have to explain why this is being done. And I'm sorry, the legitimacy of it doesn't seem to be there.
And that's why we got to close this out. So I want to thank you, Pete. Thank you for joining us. Great conversations this morning. Really appreciate it.
Not at all. Let me point out, by the way, since you mentioned the show, Your Prayer Intentions, that if people have a prayer request they want me to pray for, I record the show on Wednesdays. They can go to wqphradio.org/prayerwall and put up a prayer request, and we'll include it in the show. If they want it, they don't want to put details. If it's a private intention, just put the word private. And we'll include it in the show, and people will see that and actually pray for those requests and leave replies so that you can see what was prayed.
Very nice.
Okay, interesting. Again, Pete, thank you for joining us. For those listening, that was Peter, the tech guy in Jemmy. He's the author of Hail Mary, the Perfect Protestant and Catholic Prayer, and host of Your Prayer Intentions. That show airs on WQPH 89.3 in Shirley, Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Saturdays at noon Eastern. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're coming back to this, taking your calls and probably talking a little bit more about this specific topic on the other side of this short break. 202-521-1320 is the number, 202-521-1320. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're in the wrap segment for today's show. We've got a few callers on the line, but room for more. 202-521-1320 is the number. Let's go to Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
How y'all doing? Thanks for taking our calls. I have two comments. Pre-Julian Assange. I wrote the Pope over the weekend. I emailed a ministry that redirect the emails to the Vatican, what the Pope staff can read. And basically, I put in there asking him if he can ask Joe Biden administration, the Congress, and Senate to have discussions on Julian Assange, and hopefully that discussions turn positive for him and they can drop the charges. So that's what I've done. And also Ukraine. I don't think Russia would invade Ukraine if Ukraine attacked Donbass region. Now, they would put up a stinker if they attack Crimea, then Russia will invade. But I know Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, it is Russian-speaking Russian people that live in eastern Ukraine. But I think they might be sufficiently trained and armed to protect themselves. But to fall for a trap to invade Ukraine if the Ukrainian army attack Donbass, I don't think they'll do that because then we have another Cold War. And I think that's what the Biden administration wants, is another Cold War. It's going to be beyond the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So he can easily give the gas. If the gas canceled, going to Germany, that's Germany's loss. Russia can easily make the money up by selling it to Mongolia, China, or India, Pakistan, or someone else that need the gas. But it won't be at their loss if Nord Stream 2 is canceled. So it's a complicated thing. I just realized it over yesterday. I say it won't be Russia's loss if the Nord Stream 2 pipe is canceled, but if they give it to. But so yeah, that's it. That's all I want to say.
Tarif, thank you for the call. Yeah, I mean, another way to look at the whole Nord Stream 2 issue, when the United States pushes back on that, which it does constantly, and when politicians in Europe push back on that, what would that do? It's not just an economic agreement, of course. It would be a sort of diplomatic tie between the two countries that lessens the likelihood of war. And it is very useful for the United States to continuously bring Russia up as a boogeyman to justify more military spending and more suppression, frankly, of political dissidents and political speech at home when it suits our interests. And so anything that weakens our ability to do that is going to be seen as a net negative from the American perspective. But for the globe, it's terrible. You don't want you want whatever we can do to lessen the likelihood of another world war, barring truly tyrannical, horrible stuff on the international level. We should do it. That's my opinion, broadly speaking. We got more calls.
Financial entanglements are one of those things that does, on some odd level, weirdly enough, serve to prevent wars. Because you're right. Imagine these two countries being entangled. And I like to kind of keep pointing out that what we're finding is that Germany's real world physical matter reality needs are running up against the U.S.'s need to perpetuate this notion of the boogeyman. And it's like, we need that gas, man. We need that cheap gas. We can't, take all this time for the boogeyman stuff. So yeah, I agree with you, Shane. I do think it's this notion of perpetuating the boogeyman. And if there's this relationship there, it goes beyond just the gas. It goes into kind of this, what it means and the larger tie between the two countries as a result. Yeah, I agree with you.
Absolutely.
John,
absolutely. We got two calls on the line. Yeah, two calls on the line. Michael first, actually, and at this point, we're out of room for calls, so I would not try calling in. We got Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hey, guys. First of all, I got a simple message about religion. There is no religion. There's only God. May peace be with all the prophets and you. And that's my religion. Secondly, in terms of Russia, unless you're going to retrofit the entire European economy with LPG burners and plenty of gas fitters to fit them, it's pretty useless cutting off natural gas. And another point on voting and also currency in general, you're as fool if you think any government around the world is going to let you have anonymous currency. Blockchain is very good for voting. You have open source code where people are registered anonymously and scramble through the blockchain, but basically checked and get instantaneous voting in the results. And also, in terms of money, if your government and yourself are forced to use a cryptocurrency that is also auditable by the people, as is the voting system, because it's open source, you'll know exactly who is corrupt, who is not, where the government's spending money, what they're setting it on, and you also know if every citizen is using it legally. Otherwise, if you have anonymous currency, I could bribe a judge to send you to jail.
Interesting point, Michael. Calling in about blockchain voting. Interesting take there. Yeah, I've heard people recommending that over time. It's part of the whole wider blockchain craze, which is a sort of derogatory way to put it. widespread period of investment and support for blockchain is more positive. But yeah, people definitely talking about that. Michael, thank you for the call. We got room for one more. Let us go now to John calling in from LA. John, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Okay. First off, thank you. I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible. I had tried to get Thomas's attention about Purvis Payne. Purvis Payne is a Black individual who is severely mentally incompetent, but yet Tennessee is going to kill him in 2 days. He's on death row. And everyone at the side of my voice need to hurry up and tell the governor to put a stay on the execution because, one, a mentally incompetent man cannot stand trial, let alone be put on the death penalty. But they're talking about, but they're going to kill him. And the Innocent Project has proven the fact that most likely he is innocent. And the lawyer, the attorney, is refusing to test the other sets of
John, we gotta close it here. We're running very short on time at this point. But yeah, Purvis Payne, hadn't heard about this, but it's apparently a pretty big deal over in Tennessee. Been on death row for about 33 years at this point. And yeah, intellectual disability. Interesting story. Thank you for the call on that. We've got to close it out. I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. Thank you to our guests. Thank you, Engineer Andre. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas. Thank you to our callers. And thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Fault Lines signing off.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I will see you guys a little bit later this evening. Yeah, I'll see you guys a little bit later this evening. Thanks all. Like, share, subscribe, and shout out to Reade for coming on to the show. It was a great conversation. Thanks all.